Chapter 8, Part 2 of Memoirs of the Lady Hester Stanhope, Volume 2 by Lady Hester Stanhope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8, Part 2. Such were, in the main, the opinions of Lady Hester on astrology, to which several travellers have alluded, but which, from defective information, they have hitherto misrepresented. It will be seen that there was at least method in her belief. We will now return from this digression. Our narrative broke off in the middle of a conversation on the evening of January 31st, 1838. Tea was ordered, but so simple a process as getting tea ready was now a painful business. If it did not come immediately, Lady Hester grew so impatient that it was distressing to see her agitation. She would then ring for a pipe, and perhaps send it back to be fresh filled or changed 4 or 5 times in succession, each one being, for some trifling reason, rejected. Alas, it was not the tea nor the pipes that were in fault. It was Colonel Campbell's letter that had given a stab to her heart, from which she never recovered, and in proportion to the apparent calm which she endeavored to assume when speaking on that subject, did the feeling of the supposed indignity which she had received prey on her spirits and on her pride. She reverted to the letter. "The thing to be considered," she said, "is whether I shall write a letter to the Queen and ask the Duke of Wellington to give it to her, or whether I shall put it in the newspapers, for I'm afraid, if I send it to him, he will not give it to her. Or if he does, they will say nothing about it. I should like to ask for a public inquiry into my debts, and for what I have contracted them. Let them compare the good I have done in the cause of humanity and science with the D of K.'s debts. When I am better, I'll set all this to rights. I wonder if Lord Palmerston is the man I recollect, a young man just come from college that was hanging about, waiting to be introduced to Mr. Pitt. Mr. Pitt used to say, 'Ah, very well, we will ask him some day to dinner.' Perhaps it is an old grudge that makes him vent his spite. He is an Irishman, I think." February 1st. Today Lady Hester was much the same as on the preceding days. Her pulse was low, her lungs were loaded with phlegm, apathy had shown themselves on her tongue. Her nails were cracked from the contraction of the surrounding integuments. The tips of her fingers were cold. Her back, as she sat up in bed, was bent. Her bones almost protruded through the skin from being obliged to lie always on one side. Speaking of her inability to sleep, except in some particular position, she observed that she was like those little figures of tumblers. Place her as you would, she rolled over to the left side, as if there was a weight of lead there. After the usual preliminaries of smoking a pipe and a little conversation, she dictated her letter to the Queen and to Mr. Abercrombie, Speaker of the House of Commons. Lady Hester Stanhope to the Queen, June, February 12th, 1838. Your Majesty will allow me to say that few things are more disgraceful and inimical to royalty than giving commands without examining all their different bearings, and casting, without reason, an aspersion upon the integrity of any branch of a family who had faithfully served their country and the House of Hanover. As no inquiries have been made of me what circumstances induced me to incur the debts alluded to, I deem it unnecessary to enter into any details upon the subject. I shall not allow the pension given by your royal grandfather to be stopped by force, but I shall resign it for the payment of my debts, and with it the name of English subject and the slavery that is at present annexed to it. And as your Majesty has given publicity to the business by your orders to consular agents, I surely cannot be blamed in following your royal example. Hester Lucy Stanhope. Lady Hester Stanhope to Mr. Speaker Abercrombie, June, February 12th, 1838. Sir, probably the wheel-horse has forgotten his driver, but the latter has not forgotten him. I am told that the chief weight of the carriage of state bears upon you. If so, it must be a ponderous one indeed, if I can judge by a specimen of the talent of those who guide it. You, who have read and thought a great deal upon men and manners, must be aware that there are situations almost unknown in Europe from which persons, in what is called a semi-barbarous country, cannot extricate themselves with honor without taking a part either for or against humanity. Besides, there are extraordinary gusts of knowledge, of extraordinary information, which, if you do not take advantage of them at the moment, are lost to you forever. I have therefore exceeded my pecuniary means, but always with the hope of extricating myself without the assistance of any one. Or at least, and ever before my eyes, should the worst come to the worst, with that of selling the reversion of what I possess. Your magnificent queen has made me appear like a bankrupt in the world, and partly like a swindler, having given strict orders that one usurer's account must be paid, or my pension stopped, without taking into consideration others who have equal claims upon me. Her Majesty has not thrown the gauntlet before a driveler or a coward. Those who are the advisers of these steps cannot be wise men. Whatever men's political opinions may be, if they act from conscientious motives, I have always respected them, and you know that I have had friends in all parties. Therefore, without any reference to the past or present political career of ministers, or Her Majesty's advisers, their conduct would appear to me, respecting myself, identically as it was gentlemanlike or blackguard. But having had but too strong a specimen of the latter by their attempting to bully a Pitt, and to place me under consular control, it is sufficient for me to resign the name of an English subject. For the justice granted to the slave of despotism far exceeds that which has been shown to me. Believe me, with esteem and regard, yours, Hester Lucy Stanhope. Friday, February 2nd. Today I found her ladyship busied in sorting out certain articles of apparel which had just before been brought home for herself. They had been made by the wife of Luflufi, the person at Saida who generally lodged English travellers. As the fair sex may like to know what the texture of ladies' undergarments is in the East, these were made of half cotton and half silk, and to the appearance and touch not unlike crape. Some women have them all silk. Either kind is favorable for absorbing perspiration, and, under any circumstances, never strikes cold to the body. There had arrived also from Marseilles 6 cases of claret, 2 of brandy, 1 of rum, 12 baskets of champagne, 1 case of kirsch water, and from Leghorn 6 cases of Genoese pâté, 2 Parmesan cheeses, some Bologna sausages, pots of preserve, 1 barrel of salmon and tunny, 1 ditto of anchovies, brooms, scuppets, perfumery, 2 chests of tea, and numberless other good things to meet the wants of her expected guest, the Baroness de Ferriat, who was coming from the United States. It was sad enough that Lady Hester herself, with abundance of choice provisions and wines, was unable to partake of any. However, when samples of them were brought in, as the cases were opened one after another to be shown her, her usual, what shall I call it, greediness of manner manifested itself. She tasted everything and swallowed a great deal, the natural consequence of which was that she threw herself back in her bed, gasping for breath and suffering horribly. On these occasions her favorite plan was to relieve the succession of momentary symptoms by a host of palliatives, never leaving her stomach empty or her digestive organs at rest, and always fancying that it was want of nourishment that generated uneasiness or caused the oppression on her chest, from both of which she was never free. Nor would she listen to any arguments that tended to show she was in error. February 4th, Sunday. This morning it was discovered in my house that a silver spoon had been lost. I had a manservant and a boy, the former a Greek, the latter a Mahometan. The Greek had one of the most sinister countenances I ever beheld. He was the same man who had accompanied Mr. Moore and Mr. Beck to the Dead Sea, and had been sent to me from Beirut by the innkeeper there. He was a knave, a drunkard, and a liar. Suspicion fell on him, and he, to throw it on others, first accused the milk-girl and then the water-carrier. Theft in houses in Turkey, where many are suspected, generally leads to the punishing of them all, and Logmagi suggested that he should apply the courbash to all 3 to elicit the truth. However, I thought it more just to resort to the European way, saying if the spoon were not found, the 2 servants must pay for it, not doubting the innocence of the water-carrier, a hard-working fellow of good repute. Logmagi objected to this. "You must flog that Greek," said he, "or you will lose, one by one, everything of value you possess." Here the matter rested, as the morning had been fixed for answering Colonel Campbell's letter. So I wrote from her ladyship's dictation the following laconic epistle to him, and the friendly one to Mr. Moore, British consul at Beirut. When I had finished them, I asked Lady Hester what she would have me put at the close, and how she chose to subscribe herself. "Say nothing," replied she. "How many times I have said I could never call myself the humble servant of anybody. I hate and detest all those compliments so unmeaning and so false. But to Mr. Moore you may express my esteem and regard. I know I shall have a great liking for Mrs. Moore if ever I see her. Is she so very handsome as they say? When you go to Beirut, you must tell her that I consider it a duty to like her. She does not know why, no more do you. Lady Hester Stanhope to Colonel Campbell, June, February 4th, 1838. Sir, I shall give no sort of answer to your letter of the 10th of January, received the 27th, until I have seen a copy of Her Majesty's commands respecting my debt to Mr. Homsey, or of the official orders from Her Majesty's Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, as also of Mr. Homsey's claim, as well as of the statement sent to England, to whom and through whom, in order that I may know whom I have to deal with, as well as be able to judge of the accuracy of the documents. I hope in future that you will not think it necessary to make any apologies for the execution of your duty. On the contrary, I should wish to recommend you all to put on large Brutus wigs when you sit on the woolsack at Alexandria or at Beirut. Hester Lucy Stanhope. Lady Hester Stanhope to Mr. Moore, British Consul at Beirut, June, February 4th, 1838. Sir, the sacrifice which I have made of your acquaintance and your society, that you might stand quite clear of everything that affects me, appears to be to little purpose. You will have some very disagreeable business to go through, as you will be made Colonel Campbell's honourable agent, and he the agent of the wise Lord Palmerston, and he the agent of your magnificent Queen. There is Colonel Campbell's answer, which I leave open for your perusal, as he did his. If in the end I find that you deserve the name of a true Scotchman, I shall never take ill the part that you may have taken against me, as it appears to be consistent with your duty in these dirty times. I remain with truth and regard, yours, Hester Lucy Stanhope. End of Chapter 8, Part 2. Chapter 8, Part 3 of Memoirs of the Lady Hester Stanhope, Volume 2, by Lady Hester Stanhope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8, Part 3. Besides these letters, I wrote others for England and for Beirut, in all about a dozen. What with waiting and listening to her conversation, I was with her 5 hours before dinner and 5 hours after. I had to seal and put covers to all these, and just at the moment when I was about to retire to my study, a little room set apart for me in her house, to do this, Lady Hester stopped me and returned to the subject of the silver spoon. After some consideration, she recommended also the use of the courbash. "How am I to live," cried she, "with 30 servants in my house, and such a man as you are that can say boo to a goose? How do you expect they will mind me if you don't keep them under? Hamadi is coming tomorrow to June. He must be sent for, and shall interrogate the rascal. I warrant you he'll soon bring it to light." When I left her for dinner, she had said to me, Send me word a quarter of an hour before you return to say you are coming. This, in my hurry to get through so much writing for her, I had neglected to do, and it therefore served now as the text for a new grievance. "Didn't I say," she asked me, "let me know a quarter of an hour beforehand when you are ready to come to me?" That quarter of an hour was everything to me. I wished to have more candles brought in on account of your eyes, to have the paper and ink got ready, and to collect my thoughts. But no, everybody must do as they like, and poor I be made the sacrifice. I will live by the rule of grandeur. Then she called her maids in, one after another, poured on them a torrent of abuse for their laziness, dirt, and insolence. My heart sickened to think what would be the consequence of all this to herself, for I knew very well that her whole frame the next morning would be debilitated from such excitement. Yet all this time her passion was sublimely eloquent, and sick though she was, terrible. Her maids tumbled over each other from fright, and the thunder that rolled in the sky, for a storm was raging at the time, was but a faint likeness of her paroxysm. When it was over, we drank tea, and at 1:30 separated for the night. February 5th. The weather was still stormy. Snow fell in abundance on the higher chains of Mount Lebanon, where it lay apparently very thick. When I paid my morning visit, Lady Hester held out her hand to me the moment I approached her bedside. "I said too much last night," she observed. "Think no more about it, doctor. But you know my irritability, and you must bear with it." She was pale, languid, and extenuated. Her hands and arms were jerked in convulsive flings. Strong electrical shocks could not have shaken her so much. Alas, I sympathized too deeply with her wrongs not to forget all her ebullitions of anger the moment they were over. When she found herself a little easier, she asked me to explain to her Julius Caesar's calendar, which she had on some occasion lighted on in Ainsworth Dictionary. "When I was a girl," said she, "I knew all the constellations in the heavens, and was so quick at astronomy that they took my books and maps away, fearing I should give myself up to it to the neglect of my other studies. I had it all before my eyes, just like a pocket handkerchief. What day are the Ides of March?" I told her. "I think," she continued, "the word Ides must be derived from Ied." I guessed at once what was passing in her mind. It was an illusion with her that her destiny and Caesar's, or her character and his, had some resemblance. And when she mentioned Brutus wigs in her letter to Colonel Campbell, it had a reference to the stabs they were giving her from England in depriving her of her pension, and putting insults upon her. She was deeply wounded in her pride by the treatment she had received from home. "The Queen," she would say, "should have desired her ministers to write to me and say it grieves me that you should have exceeded your income and incurred debts, which you know, when complaints are made to me, I cannot countenance. Endeavor to pay them by installments, and all may yet be well," or something to that effect. But no, she shall have my pension, and if they make me a bankrupt, why, let them pay the usurers themselves. February 9th. I did not see Lady Hester the whole of the preceding day. She had sent me a message to say she did not wish to trouble me. I attributed this to the state of the weather, for the wind was high, the atmosphere wet and cold, and everything about the residence uncomfortable. To go from my house to Lady Hester's, I was obliged to wear high wooden clogs and a thick Greek capote with a hood to it. Umbrellas from the gusts of wind were out of the question. The ground was like soap. But it was not the weather that made her decline my visit. She had been closeted with a doctor of the country from Dair el Kamar, the son of that Meta of whom mention has been made in a former part of these pages, as having bequeathed his family as a legacy to her. He was come, as it was supposed, to give his opinion on her case. I took no umbrage at this. Lady Hester and I differed toto coello on medical points, and she told me very often, after discussions of this sort, that she had invited me to come this time not as her physician, but as a friend, one in whom she had confidence to settle her debts. The muleteers had been sent on the 7th of February to Mar Elias, to bring away the effects which had been lying there, rotting and spoiling since Miss Williams's death. I accompanied them to superintend the moving, as also to pay a visit to General Loustalot. Heavens, what waste was I witness to! In one closet was a beautiful wax miniature of Mr. Pitt, a portrait of the Duke of York, some other pictures, stationery, glass, china, medicines, etc., enough for a family. In one room were carpets, cushions, counterpanes, mattresses, pillows, all completely destroyed by mold and damp. In a storeroom were large Japan canisters with tea, preserves, sugar, wine, lamps, etc. From another room, the roof of which had fallen in at the time of the great earthquake, had disappeared, according to Lady Hester's account, 300 weight of copper utensils in cauldrons, boilers, saucepans, kettles, round platters called seneia, and many other things. A leather portmanteau lay with the lock cut out. A trunk had its hinges wrenched off, and both were emptied of their contents. Everywhere proofs of pillage were manifest, and the village of Abra was notoriously thriving by it. For 10 years this plundering system had been going on, and yet what still remained would have almost filled a house. Among other things were papers and boxes of seeds, roots, dried plants, and a variety of such matters which Lady Hester had collected. For, she would say, the importance of people's pursuits is judged in a different way by different individuals. For example, Sir Joseph Banks would think I had done wonders if I found a spider that had 2 more joints than another in his hind leg. And Sir Abraham Hume would embrace me if I had got a coin not in his collection. But I have hoarded up something for everybody. And yet, whether I have done good for humanity or for science, those English give me credit for nothing, and never even once ask how I got into debt. February 10th. I spent 4 hours with Lady Hester Stanhope this evening. She was very ill and greatly convulsed during the greater part of the time. She moaned a good deal, yet in the intervals of ease that she got, she had 2 baskets of good things packed up as a present to an old French widow, and 2 for an infirm old man, her pensioner, residing at Sida. Monday, February 13th. Lady Hester today dictated the following letter to Sir Edward Sugden. Lady Hester Stanhope to Sir Edward Sugden, June, February 12th, 1838. Sir, born an aristocrat, for this assurance I received from your father, whom it appeared to annoy as much as it delighted me, with these genuine feelings it will not be necessary for me to make any excuses for bringing so abruptly before you a subject which relates to this cause as well as that of justice. I will not bore you with long details, for it will be sufficient for you to know that after my arrival in the East I was not regarded by any class of persons with the same eyes of suspicion as strangers generally are. I have had it in my power, without making use of intrigue or subterfuge on my part, or hurting the religious or political feeling of others in any way, to hear and investigate things which had never yet been investigated. This fortunate circumstance does not relate to those who profess Islamism alone, but to all the curious religions, not sects, which are to be found in the different parts of the East. Not that I have learned the secrets of one religion to betray them to another. On the contrary, I have observed an inviolable silence with all. But it has served to enlighten, as well as consolidate my own ideas, and given me an opportunity of seeking corroboratory evidence of many wonderfully important and abstract things which has been hitherto very satisfactory. The revolutions and public calamities, which often take place in what is called a semi-barbarous country, call for great presence of mind and energy, and a degree of humanity and liberality unknown in Europe. To have unfortunate sufferers starving at your gate until you have had an opportunity of inquiring into their private life and character, and of investigating how far it is likely to endanger your own life or risk your property in receiving them, these reflections are not made in the East. One takes one's chance, and if one wishes to keep up the character of either an Eastern monarch or an Eastern peasant, you must treat even an enemy in misfortune avec le même égard that you would do a friend. Starting upon this principle, which is indeed a natural one and was always mine, there were times in which I have been obliged to spend more money than I could well afford, and this has been the cause of my incurring debts. Not that I owe a farthing to a poor peasant or a tradesman, but all to usurers and rascals that have lent their money out at an exorbitant interest. You may judge of their conscience. In the last levy of troops, made about 2 months ago by Ibrahim Pasha, some rich peasants gave 100% for 6 months for money to buy off their sons who were conscripts. I often abuse the English, and for why? Because they have nearly lost their national character. The aristocracy is a proud, morose, inactive class of men, having no great fundamental principles to guide them, and not half the power that they give to themselves, very little more worthy of being trusted by their sovereign than by the people, full of ideas, all egotistical, and full of their own importance and weight in a country which may differ from an ounce to a pound in 24 hours by the wavering political line of conduct that they may observe during that time, and which neither secures the confidence of the people nor the friendship of their sovereign. And these columns of state may be reckoned a sort of ministers without responsibility, but who ought to be willing at all times to make every possible sacrifice for the honor of the crown and for the good of the people in cases of emergency and misfortune. Had I been an English peer, do you suppose I would have allowed the Duke of York's debts to remain unpaid? I should have laid down a large sum, and have engaged my brethren to have done the same. If I had not succeeded, I should have broken my coronet, and have considered myself of neither greater nor smaller importance than the sign of a duke's head in front of a public house. But ever willing to come forward with my life and property, I should expect that the sovereign would treat me with respect. I have been written to by the Consul General for Egypt and Syria, Colonel Campbell, that if I do not pay one of my numerous creditors, I shall be deprived of my pension. I should like to see that person come forward who dares to threaten a pit. Having given themselves a supposed right over the pension, they may take it all. In the early part of my life, there was nothing I feared so much as plague, shipwreck, and debt. It has been my fate to suffer from them all. Respecting my debts, of course, I had expectations of their being settled. But if I was deceived in these expectations, I kept in view the sale of my pension, as well as of an annuity of £1,500 a year left me by my brother, if the worst came to the worst. The importance of the plan I was pursuing must, as you can easily imagine, have appeared most arbitrary, from my coolly deliberating that the moment might arrive when I should make myself a beggar. But I should have done my duty. What sort of right, then, had the Queen to meddle with my affairs, and to give orders in total ignorance of the subject, upon the strength of an appeal from a man whose claims might be half fabulous, and to offer me the indignity of forbidding a foreign consul to sign the certificate that I was among the number of the living, in order to get my pension into her hands? I have written a few lines on the subject, and there is my final determination. I shall give up my pension, and with it the name of an English subject, and the slavery that is entailed upon it. I have too much confidence in the great disposer of all things, and in the magnificent star that has hitherto borne me above the heads of my enemies, to feel that I have done a rash act. I can be anything but ignoble, or belie the origin from which I sprang. I have been assured by those not likely to deceive me that a large property has been left me in Ireland, which has been concealed from me by my relations. I have put this business into the hands of Sir Francis Burdett. But should I, in future, require a law opinion upon the subject, the little aristocratical rascal whose acquaintance I was about to make when a child, had not a democratical quirk of my father's been the reason of shutting up his family for some time in the country, and preventing the execution of your father's intention of presenting you to me, will not, I hope, take it ill that I should apply to his superior talents for advice. There is a horrible jealousy respecting the friendship that exists between me and Mr. Henri Guy, the French consul at Beirut. His grandfather, a learned old gentleman, was in constant correspondence with the great Lord Chesterfield. It is natural, therefore, that his son, the present Mr. Guy's father, should feel interested about me when I first came into the country, and Mr. Henri Guy has always put into execution his father's friendly intentions towards me. He is a very respectable man, and stands very high in the estimation of all classes of persons. And as at one time there was no English consul or agent at Sidon, the French agent sent a certificate of my life 4 times a year to England. At the death of this man, Mr. Guy sent it himself. If you honor me with a reply, I request you to address your letter to him. À soin de M. le Chevalier Henri Guy, Consul de France et Beirut. Notwithstanding, he has been named for Aleppo, as it is the only way I am likely to receive my letters unopened, or perhaps at all. Believe me, with esteem and regard, yours, H. L. Stanhope. End of Chapter 8, Part 3. Chapter 8, Part 4 of Memoirs of the Lady Hester Stanhope, Volume 2, by Lady Hester Stanhope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8, Part 4. I was much exhausted today. I had written 6 hours to her dictation the preceding day, and now sat talking until midnight. But from the late hour at which I left her, it was, as usual, impossible for me to note down even 100th part of what she said. For example, it is now nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, and much as I could wish, whilst my recollection is fresh, to make a few memorandums of the many things she has been saying, my eyelids droop, and I am forced to lay down my pen. Yet one anecdote I must try to commit to paper. In reading over the letter to Sir Edward Sugden, she made the following remark: "The peers in England may be compared to doctors who have made their fortunes. If they continue to practice, they do it out of regard to some particular families or from humane motives. They know better than those who are sick what is good for them, because they have had long practice. And if their sons are no doctors, they have heard so much talk about the matter that they sit in a corner and watch the effect of the medicine." I was struck with the resemblance of Lady Hester's style to Junius's in her letter to Sir Edward. This led me to reflect, as I had observed on many occasions, that Lady Hester's language was the counterpart of her grandfather's, whether Lord Chatham might not have been the author of Junius's letters. But it has since been suggested to me that there would be an absurdity in such a supposition, for I had no opportunity of consulting books where I was, because some of the most eloquent passages of Junius are his panegyrics on Lord Chatham, and it is not likely that he would have been guilty of writing a eulogium on himself. However, I mentioned it to her. She answered, My grandfather was perfectly capable and likely to write and do things which no human being would dream came from his hands. I once met with one of his spies," continued she, "a woman of the common class, who had passed her life dressed in man's clothes. In this way she went, as a sailor, to America, and used to write him letters as if to a sweetheart, giving an account of the enemy's ships and plans in a most masterly way, in the description of a box of tools, or in something so unlike the thing in question that no suspicion could be had of the meaning of the contents. This woman by accident passed me at a watering place, whilst I was sitting near the seaside talking to my brother, and stopped short on hearing the sound of my voice, which was so much like my grandfather's that it struck her. And there is nothing extraordinary in this. I have known a horse do the same thing. My father had 2 piebald horses. They were very vicious, and hated one of the grooms so that one day, whilst he was taking them out for exercise, one threw him, and the other flew at him and attempted to strike him with his forefeet. But as he could not succeed, the other, that had run off, turned back, seized the groom with his teeth, and bit him and shook him. That very horse went blind, and got into an innkeeper's hands, who made a post-horse of him. One day, on the high road, I saw him, and made an exclamation to somebody who was with me. The horse, although blind, knew my voice, and stopped short, just like the woman. I, too, was struck with the woman's manner, and without saying anything, went next morning at daylight, before anybody was about, to the same spot, and finding the woman there again, inquired who and what she was. A conversation ensued, and the woman was delighted, she said, to behold once again something that reminded her of her old employer. As for the ministers of the present day, she observed they are good for nothing. When I went to prefer my claim for a pension, one called me Goody Two-Shoes, and told me to go about my business. A government should never employ spies of the description generally chosen, men of a certain appearance and information, who may be enabled to mix in genteel society. They are always known or suspected. My grandfather pursued quite a different plan. His spies were among such people as Logmagi, a hardy sailor, who would get at any risk into a port, to see how many ships there were, and how many effective men, or a peddler to enter a camp, and the like. This was the way he got information as to the state of the armament at Toulon. And such a one was the woman I have just told you about, who knew me by the sound of my voice. There were 2 hairdressers in London, the best spies Bonaparte had. A hairdresser, generally speaking, must be a man of talent. So must a cook, for a cook must know such a variety of things about which no settled rules can be laid down, and he must have great judgment. Do you think I did not immediately perceive that those 4 Germans we met at were spies, directly? I never told B and Lord S, because they would have let it out again. Francois was the only one who knew it besides myself. He took an opportunity one day of saying to me, when nobody was by, "My lady, One of those Germans. Yes, yes, Francois, I understand you, answered I, before he had said 3 words. You need not put me on my guard, but I am much obliged to you. Why, my lady, said Francois, when I was one day standing sentry at Bonaparte's tent, there was one of those very gentlemen I have seen go in and out. I recollect his face perfectly. Francois was right, doctor. There they were. There was the sick one, and the learned one, and the musician, and the officer, for all sorts of persons. You recollect, when we were at Constantinople, one day I went to meet the Count de la Tour Maubourg on the banks of the Bosphorus, and he intimated to me that I had kept him waiting. Yes, said I, there was a spy following my boat. I knew him directly, and wanted to prevent his dogging me. Pooh! Nonsense! Replied Mr. de la T.M. But we had not talked for half an hour when, lo, there he was taking a look at us. Next day, when I saw Mr. Canning, "Oh, Lady Hester," said he, "how did you spend your day yesterday?" "Why," answered I, "your spy did not spoil it." "Ah," rejoined he, laughing, for he perceived at once that it was of no use to make a mystery of what he had done. "You should not do such things. I must write it home to government." "Yes," said I, "I'll write a letter, too, in this way. My lord, your excellent young minister, to show his gallantry, has begun his diplomatic career by watching ladies in their assignations, etc., etc." And then I laughed at him, and then I talked seriously with him, till I worked on his feelings in a way you can't think. Spies, as I said before, should never be what are called gentlemen, or have the appearance of such. For however well they may be paid, somebody else will always pay them better. Unless fortune should throw in your way a man of integrity, who from loyalty or love of his country will adventure everything for the cause he is engaged in, such a man is another sort of thing. February 14th. Being Wednesday, I was, as usual, deprived of the honor of seeing Lady Hester until night. I therefore remained with my family, and having recovered the lost spoon which my servant produced out of fear of Hamadi's examination, pretending to have found it, I took the opportunity of settling his wages and turned him away. After sunset, I waited on her. She was in low spirits. "I am very weak," said she. "Look at my veins. They did not used to be so. Look at my arms, too, mere skin and bone." She pointed to the state of her room. "See how filthy it is again already," she observed. "And if I say a word, those wretches seem not to mind me. They snub me, doctor." She attempted to dictate the letter she proposed writing to the Duke of Wellington, but was unable. We drank tea. "Do you know," she said, "when old Malty," this was the name Mr. Abella, the English agent, was generally designated by, "came in such a hurry the other day with Colonel Campbell's letter, and made such a fuss about delivering it with his own hand, people fancied I was going to die, and that he was come up to seal my effects the moment the breath should be out of my body. But if I do die, they shan't seal anything of mine. I'll take care of it. For I am no longer an English subject, and therefore they have nothing to do with me. Again she asked me to take my pen and paper, and returned to the Duke of Wellington's letter. "I can't collect my ideas," she said. "One while I am thinking of what Mr. Pitt said of him, then of the letter he wrote when invited down to the country ball, then of what he is now. So put down your paper and ring for a pipe. The Duke is a man self-taught, for he was always in dissipation. I recollect one day Mr. Pitt came into the drawing-room to me. 'Oh,' said he, 'how I have been bored by Sir Sidney coming with his box full of papers and keeping me for a couple of hours when I had so much to do.' I observed to him that heroes were generally vain. Lord Nelson is so." "So he is," replied Mr. Pitt, "but not like Sir Sidney. And how different is Arthur Wellesley, who has just quitted me. He has given me details so clear upon affairs in India, and he talked of them, too, as if he had been a surgeon of a regiment, and had nothing to do with them, so that I know not which to admire most, his modesty or his talents. And yet the fate of India depends upon them. And, Doctor, when I recollect the letter he wrote to Edward Bovary, in which he said that he could not come down to the ball which Bovary had invited him to, for that his only corbeau coat was so bad he was ashamed to appear in it, I reflect what a rise he has had in the world. Bovary said, 'You would like to dance with him amazingly, Lady Hester. He is a good fellow.' He was at first, Doctor, nothing but what hundreds of others are in a country town, a man who danced and drank hard. His star has done everything for him, for he is not a great general. He is no tactician, nor has he any of those great qualities that make a Caesar or a Pompey or even a Bonaparte. As for the Battle of Waterloo, both French and English have told me that it was a lucky battle for him, but nothing more. I don't think he acted well at Paris, nor did the soldiers like him." Thursday, February 15th. This morning the letter to the Duke of Wellington was written. Lady Hester Stanhope to the Duke of Wellington, June, February 13th, 1838. My dear Duke, if you merit but half the feeling and eloquent praise I heard bestowed upon you shortly before I saw you for the first time, you are the last man in the world either to be offended or to misconstrue my motives in writing to you upon the subject in question, or not to know how to account for the warmth of the expressions I may make use of, which are only characteristic of my disposition. Your Grace's long residence in the East will have taught you that there is no common-rate character in England an adequate judge what manner of living best answers among a semi-barbarous people, and how little possible it is to measure one's expenses where frequent revolutions and petty wars are carried on without any provision for the sufferers, from its being considered the duty of everyone to assist them as his humanity may dictate, or as his circumstances may afford. Acre besieged for 7 months. Some days 7,000 balls thrown in 24 hours. At last taken by storm, and little more than 200 of the garrison remaining. Then the wretched inhabitants, who expected to find succor from their old friends in the country, finding their backs turned upon them in the dread and awe they stood in of Ibrahim Pasha. Nay, it is very strange to say that the Franks likewise held back in a most extraordinary manner. Therefore, these unhappy people had no resource but in me, and I did the best I could do for them all. Mahomet Ali, Ibrahim Pasha, Sheriff Pasha, all said at me at once in order to make me give up certain persons who immediately would have lost their heads for having fought well in the cause which they were engaged in. I opposed them all round single-handed, and said that I neither protected these persons in the English or French name, but in my own, as a poor Arab, who would not give up an unhappy being but with his own life, that there was no other chance of making me bend by any other means than by attempting mine. In this manner I saved some unfortunate beings, whom I got rid of by degrees, by sending them back to their own country, or providing for them at a distance in some way or another. Can you, as a soldier, blame me for what I have done? I should have acted in the same way before your eyes to the victims of your own sword. Then the host of orphans and widows and little children, who to feed or clothe for nearly 2 years took away all the ready money with which I ought in part to have paid my debts, and caused new ones. Yet I am no swindler, and will not appear like one. Your queen had no business to meddle in my affairs. In due time, please God, I should have known how to arrange to satisfy everybody, even if I left myself a beggar. If she pretends to have a right to stop my pension, I resign it altogether, as well as the name of an English subject, for there is no family that has served their country and the crown more faithfully than mine has done, and I am not inclined to be treated with moins d'égard than was formerly shown to a gentleman-like highwayman. I have been every day in expectation of a reply from Sir F. Burdett respecting a large property which is said to have been left me in Ireland, and which has been concealed from me for many years. In case of its coming into my hands, I shall still not keep my pension, in order to cut off every communication with the English government, from whom only proceed acts of folly, which any moment may rebound upon an individual. I chose Sir Francis Burdett to look into my affairs, because I believe him to be a truly conscientious, honest man. Although we always disagreed upon politics, we were always the best friends, and it appears to me that he is beginning to see things in their proper light. All that I have to entreat of your grace is to allow me to appear in the light in which I really stand, attached to humanity, and attached to royalty, and attached to the claims that one human being has upon another. Nor can I allow myself to be deemed an intriguer, because I have said here in all societies that persons who abet those who attempt to shake the throne of Sultan Mahmud shake the throne of their own sovereign, and therefore commit high treason. and among that class of persons I do not choose to rank myself. Nor am I to be reckoned an incendiary when I seek to vindicate my own character that never was marked with either baseness or folly. It may have been, perhaps, with too little consideration for what are called by the world my own interests, and which I, in fact, despise, or at least only consider in a secondary point of view. There is nobody more capable of making the Queen understand that a Pitt is a unique race than your Grace. There is no trifling with them. I have sent a duplicate of the enclosed letter to Her Majesty to my Lord Palmerston, through the hands of the English consul, Mr. Moore. If it has not reached her safe, I hope that you will see that this one does, or otherwise I shall put it in the Augsburg Gazette, or in an American newspaper. Hester Lucy Stanhope. End of Chapter 8, Part 4. Chapter 8, Part 5 of Memoirs of the Lady Hester Stanhope, Volume 2, by Lady Hester Stanhope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8, Part 5. At 11 at night I joined her at tea in her bedroom. She then asked me to read all the letters over to see if anything wanted correction. After that, calling for her old parchment-covered blotting book, she took them one by one and folded them herself, in order, as she said, to give me instructions on that head. Generally speaking, she never seemed more happy than when she had a huge packet of dispatches to put up. I dare say it reminded her of former times. She began, "Now, Doctor, a letter to a great man should fold over exactly to the middle, thus. Lord, what counting-house paper have you got here? This will never do." It was the thin paper common in France as letter paper. I told her it was the very best there was in the house, and added, to quiet her, that thick paper, when fumigated in quarantine, as this must be, generally seemed to me to suffer more than thin, which is the fact. Well, it is too late now to alter it, so it must go as it is. She then folded the cover with great exactitude, but looking round her, she cried, "There now! That black beast has not given me the seal! Ding, ding! Zezaphoon, where's the seal?" Zezaphoon was the only servant who was permitted to touch the seal, and she always had orders to put it away carefully, so that the other maids should not know where it was, for fear they should lend it to some rascal like Jirius Jamel, she would say, who would put her signature to some forged letter or paper. And Zezaphoon, as is customary with uneducated persons, hid it very often so carefully that she could not find it herself. After turning books and papers upside down, at last she produced it. Whilst melting the wax in the candle, Lady Hester went on, "Doctor, you never now can seal a letter decently. You once used to do it tolerably well, but now you have lost your memory and all your faculties, from talking nothing but rubbish and empty nonsense to those nasty women, and that's the reason why you never listen to anything one says, and answer yes and no without knowing to what." I gave her the letters in succession to seal, until exhausted by the effort, for now the least thing was too much for her. She fell back in her bed. She roused herself again and said, "Now let's direct them. Where is the one to the Queen? Write Victoria Regina, nothing else, in the middle. That will do very well. Whose is that? The Speaker's. Very well. I wonder if it is the brother I used to play driving horses with, for there were several brothers. Now, look for his address. James, that's him. Direct to the Right Honourable Speaker. No, stop. Put to the Right Honourable James Abercrombie, with 3 etceteras, Carlton Gardens." The next letter was the Duke of Wellington's. Lady Hester said, "Let me see. He's a field marshal. Never mind. You must begin to His Grace the Duke of Wellington, K.G." I accordingly did so, and not knowing how much more was coming to complete the superscription, I put it all, for fear of wanting room, into one line. Her eye was on me as I wrote. "What's that? Show it me," she cried out. And taking the letter in her hands, she put on her spectacles. What an exclamation burst from her! "Good God, Doctor, are you mad? What can you mean? What is this vulgar ignorance, not to know that His Grace should be in one line, and the Duke of Wellington, K.G., in the other? What people will he fancy I am got among? Why, the lowest clerk in the Foreign Office would not have made such a blunder. This is your fine Oxford education." And then she gave a deep sigh, as if in utter despair, to think that a letter should go forth from her hands so different in paper, seal, and address from those of her early days, when she reigned in Downing Street co-equal with Mr. Pitt. Now it was a rickety old card-table, a rush-bottomed chair, a white pipe-clay inkstand, wax that would not be used in a counting-house in Cheapside, and both the Sultaness and her vizier, for so I shall presume to style her and myself, fitting their spectacles on their noses, equally blind, equally old, and almost equally ailing. I finished the address to the Duke. "How many etceteras have you put?" asked Lady Hester. "What, only 2? I suppose you think he's a nobody?" The remaining letters were directed without farther trouble, but by some unaccountable blunder Sir Edward Sugden was made a Sir Charles of. A long deliberation ensued whether the letter to Her Majesty should be enclosed in a cover to Lord Palmerston, or whether it should be left to be seen by the English consul at Beirut to frighten him. It was now 3 o'clock in the morning. I quitted Lady Hester, and had Ali Hashem, the confidential messenger, called out of his bed. I repeated to him Lady Hester's instructions as follows. "You are to take this packet and start at sunrise precisely, not before and not after, and to take care you deliver the letters into M. Guy's hands before sunset, for it is Friday, and Friday is an auspicious day. There are 10 piastres for your 2 days' keep, and let no one know where you are going, nor for what." Ali was accustomed to this business, laid his hand on his head to signify that should answer for his fidelity, made a low salaam, went to the cook for his 5 bread cakes, turned in again upon his libad, pulled his counterpane over his body, face and all, and I dare say was punctual to his hour and his instructions. Men of this sort, who are generally chosen from the peasantry, are invaluable as foot messengers. With a nabut or small bludgeon, well knobbed at one end, and with a few bread cakes in their girdle, they will set off at any hour, in any weather, for any place, and go as quick as a horseman. They sleep anywhere and anyhow, and deliver their messages and letters with exceeding punctuality. Ali was a handsome fellow, the picture of health, fearless of danger, and a great favorite with Lady Hester, to whose service he was devoted. Therefore, at every Bairam, Ali was sure to be seen in a new set of clothes, the envy of the men, and the admiration of all the girls of June. But he knew how to make a proper use of his money. Already he had begun to trade with some success in silk, advancing small sums in the winter to the poor women who breed silkworms, for which he received silk in payment. This he resold in the city. And those who may chance to meet with Ali 10 years hence might find in him a warm tradesman, smoking his pipe in the midst of his obsequious dependents, and dignified with the title of Sheik or Malem. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9, Part 1 of Memoirs of the Lady Hester Stanhope, Volume 2, by Lady Hester Stanhope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, Part 1. Friday, February 16th, 1838. About 2 in the afternoon, on going to pay my visit to Lady Hester Stanhope, I proceeded to her bedroom, thinking, as usual, to find her there. I was told by her maids she was gone into the garden. The day was overcast, and there was every appearance of rain. I found her standing in one of the garden walks, leaning on her stick, such as those which elderly ladies were accustomed formerly to use in England, and perhaps may now, and pale as a ghost. "Doctor," said she, "I have got out of my room that those beasts may clean it, but if you don't go to them, they'll steal everything." After expressing my fears that she had chosen a bad day to come out, I left her. I saw her room put into as much order as the confusion in it would admit of. It was crowded with bundles one upon another, as before, which she dared not put into any other part of the house, lest they should be stolen. Independent of her desire to be more clean and comfortable, I guessed at once why she had left her bedroom to go into the garden. It was the struggle which the sick often make, the resolution of an unsubdued spirit that finds corporeal ailments weighing down the body, whilst the mind is yet unsubdued. It was Friday, too, the day in all the week she held as most auspicious. When I returned into the garden, I found her lying on a sofa in a beautiful alcove, one of 3 or 4 that embellished her garden, and an attendant standing with his hands folded across his breast in an attitude of respect before her. At these moments she always wore the air of a sultaness. In this very alcove, how often had she acted the queen, issued her orders, summoned delinquents before her, and enjoyed the semblance of that absolute power which was the latent ambition of her heart. Hence it was that she at last got rid of all European servants, because they would not submit to arbitrary punishments, but would persist in raising their voices in self-justification. With the Turks it was not so. Accustomed, in the courts of governors and pashas, to implicit obedience and submission, they resigned themselves to her rule as a matter of course. In transferring, however, their servility to her as their mistress, they also transferred the vices and dangers which servility engenders, namely lying, theft, sycophancy, intrigue, and treachery. Saturday, February 17th. During the whole of this day I did not see Lady Hester, and I was not sorry for it. Her thoughts were now constantly running on the inexplicable silence of Sir Francis Burdett. "He is a man of honor," she would say. "I suppose he has to write to Ireland, and to the right and left about my property. Perhaps they have got hold of him, too. Who knows? I am sure something must have happened." As each succeeding steamboat arrived, a messenger was sent to Beirut, but still no answer. Then she reflected what she should do if Sir Francis at last should furnish her with proofs that no property had been left her. Beggary stared her in the face. In the meantime, she had no means of raising a single farthing before the 1st of March, when she could draw for £300. But of this sum, £200 were due to Mr. Dromokaiti, a Greek merchant at Beirut, who had lent her money at an exorbitant interest, but on her word, and this, therefore, she would pay, I knew, if possible. During all this time, my family remained in almost total ignorance of what was going on within Lady Hester's walls, as much as if they had been living in China. I was also, as I have said above, obliged to conceal, in a great measure, her illness from them. They rode and walked out on the mountains, fed their bulbuls, enjoyed the fine climate, and wondered what made me look so thin and careworn. For thought and care preyed on my spirits, and I wasted away almost as perceptibly as Lady Hester herself. Sunday, February 18th. Today Lady Hester was sitting up in the corner of her bedroom. Her look was deadly pale, and her head was wrapped up in flannels, just like her grandfather the last day he appeared in the House of Lords. Without intending it, everything she did bore a resemblance to that great man. Ali had returned from Beirut without a letter. "Did Ali Hisham," she asked me, "set off at sunrise on Friday? I'm glad he did. Do you know, I once sent Brutus to Beirut to fetch money, and I said to him, if you get it on Monday night, don't come away on Tuesday or Wednesday, for those are unlucky days. Loiter away those 2 days, and be here on Thursday night." However, he paid no attention to my instructions, and on Wednesday evening he made his appearance. "Why did you come before Thursday?" I asked him. He answered that the bag of money having been delivered to him, he had brought it immediately. "And you see, my lady, here it is. Nobody, thank God, has robbed me." "That does not signify," I told him. "You will see there is no Bereki blessing in it. Do you know, doctor, I paid the people's wages immediately, and it was well I did. For some 10 or 12,000 piastres, chest and all, disappeared the next day. "There, look," said I to him, I told you that money never would turn to account." The conversation reverted to Colonel Campbell's letter. "I have told the secretary," said she, "to tell his father that if he dares make his appearance here again, I'll send a bullet through his body. Not one of them shall lay their vile hands on me or mine. I have strength enough to strangle him, and I would do it, though it should cost me my life. As for Mr. Moore, he may perhaps have a habeas corpus by him, but it is good for 24 hours only, and I should know how to manage. Consuls have no right over nobility. They may have over merchants and such people, but they never shall come near me, and I would shoot the first that dared to do it. The English are a set of intermeddling, nasty, vulgar, odious people, and I hate them all. The very Turks laugh at them. Out of ridicule they told one, if he was so clever, to straighten a dog's tail. Yes, he might straighten and straighten, but it would soon bend again. And they may bend me and bend me if they can, but I fancy they will find it a difficult matter. For you may tell them that when I have made up my mind to do a thing, no earthly being can alter my determination. If they want a devil, let them try me, and they shall have enough of it. When the steamboat came and brought no letter to-day from Sir Francis Burdett, you thought I should be ill on receiving the news. But I am not a fool. I suppose he is occupied with his daughter's legacy or with parliamentary business. I had received a letter from a lady, which I had occasion to read to her. When I had done, and she had expressed her thanks for the flower seeds sent her, she added, "What I do not like in Mrs. Yu's letter is that foolish way of making a preamble about her not liking to leave so much white paper in all its purity, and all those turns and phrases which people use. That was very well for a Swift or Pope, who, having promised to write to somebody once a fortnight, and having nothing to say, made a great number of points to fill up the paper. But a letter that has matter in it should be written with a distinct narration of the business, and that's all. Do you think such people as Mr. Pitt or Lord Chatham, my grandfather, liked those nonsensical phrases? No, they threw the letter aside, or else cast their eyes over it to see if on the other page there was anything to answer about. February 19th. I was riding this morning with my family beyond the village, which is separated by a deep valley from Lady Hester's residence, when I saw 2 servants on the verge of the opposite hill vociferating, "Come directly, come instantly," and waving their white turbans. I reflected that if I put my horse into a gallop, the people of the village would immediately conclude that Lady Hester was dying, and the news, as news always gains by distance, would be the next day at Saida that she was dead. I therefore continued the same pace, and although the servants redoubled their signs and cries, I steadily retraced my steps. When I had dismounted, I was told her ladyship was in a deplorable way, unlike anything they had ever seen. I hurried to her bedroom. She was sitting on the side of the bed, weeping and uttering those extraordinary cries, which I have before compared to something hardly human. She clasped her hands and exclaimed repeatedly, "Oh, God! Oh, God! What misery! What misery!" when she was a little calmed, and I could collect from her what was the matter, she told me that, having fallen into a doze, she awoke with a sense of suffocation from tightness across her chest, and being unable to ring or call, she thought she should have died. "Thus," said she, "am I treated like a dog, with nobody to administer to my wants." And so she went on in the usual strain. I was suffering at this time from the nettle rash, but treated it lightly, and thought Lady Hester would do so too, until, having unluckily alluded to it, a fresh source of uneasiness was inadvertently started. "Good God, doctor," she cried, "to come out of doors with a nettle rash on you! Go to your house immediately. Get to bed. Keep yourself warm, and remain there until it is cured. After 4 or 5 days, take such and such things, then go to the bath, then take some bark, etc., etc. How many persons have I known go mad and die from it? You treat it as nothing. Why, you will drive me crazy. In God's name, never mind me. Only go and take care of yourself. You will act in your own usual inconsiderate manner, and I shall have to bury another in this house. Oh, God! Oh, God! What am I doomed to?" And then followed fresh cries and fresh lamentations. Could Sir Francis Burdett have seen all this, and have known that 5 words of a letter, sent a month or 2 sooner in answer to her inquiries about the property she thought was left her, would have probably saved all this excitement, he would have found reason to reproach himself for his long silence. I knew the workings of her mind full well, and that her proud spirit, wounded by the general neglect she met with, vented itself in tears, seemingly for other causes than the real ones. I recollected a succession of similar scenes about 20 years before at Mar Elias, when she was expecting letters from the Duke of Buckingham. But then she was sounder in bodily health, and could better bear such convulsive paroxysms of grief. Now she was laboring under pulmonary disease, was old, was in distress, and the consequences might prove fatal. I left her before dinner. "Good-bye, doctor," she said in a kind tone. "I cannot tell you how much I am obliged to you for everything you do for me. And send me a servant twice a day to let me know how you are. I shall be uneasy about you. I can't help it. From my childhood I have been so. How many times in my life have I spent days and days in trying to make others comfortable? I have been the slave of others and never got any thanks for it." I went to my house, collected all the money that remained, which was about £11, and sent it to her to meet the current expenses of the household. For so she wished that I might not be annoyed, she said, and have the rash driven in on my brain. I experienced no ill effects from the nettle rash. Few persons, new to the climate of Syria, escape a rash of some description, sometimes pustular, sometimes miliary, but most frequently in the form called prickly heat, which generally attacks them in summer or autumn, and is truly distressing by the pricking sensation it produces on the skin, as if thousands of needle-points were penetrating the cuticle. Little is required in such cases but cool diet, fruit, and diluents. I performed my quarantine of 4 days, in compliance with Lady Hester's wishes, and then returned to my customary mode of life. Saturday, February 24th. As I had anticipated, a report had become very general in Beirut and in the mountain that Lady Hester was dead, and I received a letter from M. Guy acquainting me with it. This report was confirmed by an English gentleman who presented himself at my gate this day after breakfast. I was carpentering at the time, and went down the yard to him with my hatchet and chisel in my hand. He seemed not to know what to make of me, dressed as I was in Turkish clothes, with a beard, and with my sleeves turned up like a mechanic. He held out a letter to me, addressed in a fair hand to Lady Hester. I told him this was not her gate, and that a little beyond he would find it. He said he had heard she was dead. I assured him that was not the case, but that she was greatly indisposed. I regretted to myself that I could not ask him in or enter into conversation with him, but Lady Hester had exacted from me a solemn promise that I never would hold any parley with English travellers until I had first conferred with her on the subject, and had described them so that she might obtain the necessary indications to enable her to guess what their business was, or until she had read their letter of introduction if they bore one. So he quitted me, first asking whether I was an Englishman, to which I answered that I left him to judge. He appeared to be about 21 years of age. He had with him for his servant a Ragusan, whom my servant knew, and who, he assured me, was a drunken reprobate. Short as the stop at the gate was, the Ragusan found time to tell the other that he had famous wages. I think it was $8 a month. Now I gave mine, who was also a European, 4, which was considered good pay, the rate being, in Lady Hester's house, from 1 to 3. Europeans, however, always get more than people of the country, and have more wants to satisfy. How many travellers are obliged, on their landing in these countries, to take fellows into their service without a character, outcasts of society, and who in England would hardly be allowed to see the outside of a jail. Of this English gentleman Lady Hester never spoke to me, nor did she ever even allude to his visit. He did not see her, and I presume continued his road. But if these pages ever meet his eye, he may be assured that he would have met with a hospitable reception had she been well enough to receive him, or had I been at liberty to entertain him. Whilst at dinner, a servant came to say Lady Hester would be glad to see me in the evening. I found her weak and wan. Her cheeks were sunken, and her voice was less distinct than usual. For never was there a person who spoke generally with so clear an enunciation. Logmagi was with her. Instead of receiving her welcome, and those obliging expressions which she usually employed even after the most trifling ailment, she addressed me harshly, and seemed to take pains to mortify me by using slighting expressions in Arabic, that Logmagi might understand what she said. The theme of her conversation was the debasement of men who suffered themselves to be controlled by their wives. Although to mortify people was one of her constant practices through life, whether in action, correspondence, or conversation, yet it never was done to gratify any malignant feelings of her own, but from a fearless disregard of the conventional rules of civilized society, where she hoped to rescue an individual from debasement, or counteract the machinations of designing and wicked men. On this principle it is true, likewise, that she would deliberately inflict those incurable insults which cover a man with a sort of shame for life, as may be shown, for example, by the case of Mr. Hannah Masad, the son of the British agent at Beirut, one of whose whiskers and eyebrows was shaved off before the whole village, for having made an assertion then supposed to be false, but which was afterwards, by her own confession to me, admitted to be true. Hannah, or John Masad, a handsome young man, a native of Beirut, and the son of a former English vice-consul, was interpreter and secretary to Lady Hester for some time, and her ladyship has since bestowed great praise, in my presence, on his capacity, usefulness, and knowledge of languages. There was in her service also Michael Tutunji, son of an Armenian, who had been under dragoman, as I understood, to the English embassy at Constantinople. Masad, it was thought, was jealous of Michael. It was reported in the family that Michael had been seen under a tree in very close conversation with a peasant girl, and the report was traced to Masad. Now, the Emir Bashir affected or really felt a great horror of all licentiousness, and never failed to bastinado severely every man detected in his principality in any such conduct. Lady Hester knew what imputations might be cast on her establishment if such things were left unnoticed, and fearing that Masad's intrigues, of which she thought this report but a link, might injure Michael's character, and destroy his prospects of getting a place in the English embassy at Constantinople, to which he had some pretensions from his father's services, she resolved to save him by making a signal example of Masad. End of Chapter 9, Part 1. Chapter 9, Part 2 of Memoirs of the Lady Hester Stanhope, Volume 2, by Lady Hester Stanhope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, Part 2. She, therefore, ordered all the villagers from June to be assembled on the green in front of her house, and sent for Mustafa, the barber from Saida, with 2 or 3 other tradesmen to be witnesses. Seating herself on a temporary divan, with all the assembly in a circle around her, not a soul dreaming what was going to take place, and Michael and Masad standing in respectful attitudes, with their arms crossed and covered, down to the fingers' ends, with their beniches by her side, she began. "That young man," said she, pointing to Michael, "is accused of irregularities with—" here she mentioned the girl's name, and the place and time of the meeting. "Now, if any one of you knows him to have been guilty of similar actions, or if, from his general conduct under similar circumstances, any one of you thinks the thing probable, speak out, for I wish to do justice. Masad is his accuser. They are both my people, and equally entitled to impartiality." As nobody answered, she appealed to them all again, and they all replied that they did not believe it. She then turned to Masad and said, "Sir, you have accused this young man, who is about to be launched into the world, and has only his good name to help him on of abominable things. Where are your witnesses?" Masad, frightened out of his senses, replied that he had no witnesses, that he had seen with his own eyes what he had asserted, and therefore knew it to be so. But as he was alone, it must rest on his own word. Her ladyship told him his word would not do against the concurring testimony of all the servants and of a whole village, and she added, in a judge-like tone, "As your mouth and your eye have offended, the stigma shall remain on them. Servants, seize and hold him, and barber, shave off one side of his mustachios and one eyebrow." This was done. Michael was kept about a month or two, in order that the protection he enjoyed might seal his unblemished reputation, and then was packed off to Constantinople. "Thus," said Lady Hester, "I saved a young man from destruction. Masad has now a good place under the Sardinian consul at Beirut. His eyebrows and mustachios are grown again. He has married and has a family. And I dare say the Sardinian consul, if he knows anything of the story, thinks not a bit the worse of him." The above are the words in which Lady Hester, on the 20th of January, 1831, related this singular punishment, inflicted with the best intentions on poor Masad. One evening in 1837, when writing a letter to the same Masad for certain commissions which he had to execute for her ladyship, who was in the habit of employing him to buy pipes, cloth, and sundry other articles found in the shops at Beirut, she spoke to me as follows: "You know, doctor, all that affair about Michael and Masad, and how I had one side of his face shaved. Well, I found out afterwards that what Masad had said was every bit of it true. I have made it up to him since as well as I could. He does not want abilities, and kept my house in excellent order whilst he was with me." But this was not the first time Lady Hester had resorted to this singular mode of punishment. Some years before, a chastisement for similar frailties, not unlike that which Masad underwent, as far as regarded the eyebrows, fell to the lot of a peasant girl in her ladyship's service at a village called Mushmushi. This was in the year 1813. How fallible are the most clear-sighted persons is the only comment which can be made on such unintentional errors. For those who were not exempt from the common weaknesses of our nature, she was a dangerous person to hold intercourse with. "Live at a distance from my lady," General Loustanu used to say to Mrs. M., when she wanted to remove from Mar Elias to Darjoun in order to be near me. "Live at a distance, or you will find, to your cost, that her neighborhood is a hell." But be it said, to her honor, that it was from an unfeigned horror of everything mean, dishonest, or vicious she so resolutely refused to keep terms with people who suffered themselves to be led into the commission of such acts. And her indignation descended with equal impartiality on friends and foes when they happened to deserve it. Her disposition to utter the truth, whether painful or disagreeable, overruled all other considerations. Few people conversed with her, or received a letter from her, without being sensible of some expression or innuendo which they were obliged to treat as a joke at the moment, but which was sure to leave its sting behind. Of upwards of 100 letters which I have penned for her at her dictation to correspondents of every rank in life, there were few which did not contain some touch of merited sarcasm or reproof, except those which were expressly written to alleviate distress or encourage the hopeful efforts of modest worth. Never was there so inflexible a judge, or one who would do what she thought right, come what would of it. Fiat justitia, ruat coelum might have been written on her escutcheon. Sunday, February 25th. Having recovered her tranquillity, she was today all kindness. I mentioned to her the report rife in Beirut respecting her death, as M. Guy had written it. She observed on it, "If I do die, those consuls, thank God, can have nothing to do with me. I am no English subject, and they have no right to seal up my effects. Why do I keep some of my servants, although I know them to be desperate rascals, but because they have one or two qualities useful to me? It would not do for every one to run the risk, but it will for me who know how to manage them. For example, I have got 2 that I can depend upon for shooting a man, or giving a consul a good blow if he dares to set his foot within my doors, so as to prevent his ever coming again. And such are what I want just now." She turned over in her mind how she could raise a little money, and bethought herself of Mr. Michael Tutungi, the Armenian of Constantinople, who had formerly served her in the capacity of dragoman. To him she had written in 1836, offering him the same situation he had held before, and on his promise to come had forwarded to him $500 for the expenses of his journey and for some commissions. But he subsequently declined the engagement, neither had he executed the commissions. She therefore desired me to draw a bill on him, payable to M. Guy's order, and to request M. Guy to discount it, for during my nettle rash Lady Hester had given away the greatest part of the 1,190 piastres to a family ruined by the earthquake. It was in vain to represent to her that she was in want of the money herself. "I can't help it," she would say. "I am not mistress of myself on such occasions." Tuesday, February 27th. Lady Hester got up, went into her garden, and felt better. She had at last found out that repletion, arising even from what would be called small quantities of food and drink in health, was very injurious in sickness, and she had grown more moderate in her diet, not swallowing one liquid upon another, nor eating 4 or 5 times a day. Honey and butter mixed was now what she derived most benefit from, and spermaceti linctuosus. The moment she found anything soothed her cough, she immediately sent off an order to Beirut for an immense quantity of it, or to Europe if at Beirut it was not to be had. She was never satisfied that her medicine chest was full enough. It will hardly be credited that of Epsom salts she had a caskful of the size of a firkin. She masticated anise seeds as a remedy against dyspepsia, and smoked them sprinkled on the tobacco of her pipe. Of course, they were very injurious to her, but it was idle to remonstrate. February 29th. Lady Hester's first topic of conversation today was her maids. "What a hywan (beast) is that Sadie?" she said. When she awakes in the morning, she crawls on all fours exactly like an animal. I am convinced she is nothing more. Her back is only fit to carry a pair of panniers. I agreed with her ladyship, and told her what I had seen her do the day before. With one springing lift, she raised from the floor to her head a circular mancale, or chafing dish, 2 feet in diameter, and piled up with live coals. And without holding it, but merely balancing it on her head, she stooped perpendicularly and seized with her 2 hands another mancale of baked earth of equal size, filled with live coals also, and lifting it, carried them both at once into the drawing-room to warm the apartment. These are the feats of dexterity and strength in which Syrian women excel, and in which they far surpass all European maids. March 1st. Monsieur Henri Guy, the French consul, having been advanced to the superior situation of Aleppo, and being about to quit our part of the country, arrived unexpectedly at June to take his leave. It was Tuesday, and just after sunset, when he entered the gate. Lady Hester had, about a quarter of an hour before, hurried me away from her as the sun was going to set, and it would have been unlucky had I left her a minute after the sun was down. "I shall not see you tomorrow," said she, "as it will be Wednesday." Therefore, when she was told that Monsieur Guy was come, it discomposed her very much, and she sent word that whatever his business was, she could not see him until after sunset next day. As M. Guy was thus transferred to me for 24 hours, I took the opportunity of letting him know how disquieted I felt at having such great responsibility on my shoulders whilst Lady Hester was so ill, and surrounded by a set of servants whom I considered as so many cutthroats. My position was extremely uncomfortable. Should Lady Hester die, I foresaw that I should be exposed, alone as I was, to many difficulties and dangers. The Druze insurrection afforded every facility to an assassin or robber for putting himself beyond the reach of justice, since, in about 5 or 6 hours, he could find a sure refuge from capture. He revived my spirits by assuring me I need be under no alarm. "All of them are known," said he, "to have their families and relations hereabouts. That one circumstance must always be a check upon them. If they were not natives of the province, then I should say you were not safe among them. As for Lady Hester, you know her determined character. If she is resolved to keep them, you cannot help it. There is one," added he, "whom I could wish not to be here. I thought him gone a year ago." This was the one whom Lady Hester relied on for sending a bullet through the consul's body. There is a large stone edifice of great extent, distant about 3/4 of a mile, as the crow flies, from the village of June, more like a fortress than the peaceable habitation of Cenobites. It is the monastery of Dair el Michaelis, or the Saviour, and contains about 50 friars of the Greek Catholic Church, which repudiates the Pope, recognizing as its spiritual head its own patriarch. M. Guy enjoyed the unlimited confidence of these people as the well-tried and efficient friend of the Catholic Church throughout Syria, and it was no sooner known that he was in the neighborhood then the superior of the monastery gave him to understand that a visit from him would be received as a great honor by the monks. M. Guy devoted the morning to this gratifying object, and his reception was in the highest degree flattering. When he arrived at the foot of the mount, on the summit of which the monastery stands, he was saluted by a merry chime of church bells, and then the whole body of the friars, with the cross borne before them, came out in procession to meet him. The greatest ceremony was observed on the occasion, and sherbet, coffee, pipes, aspersion of rose-water, and homage were lavished on him, not less in the hope of securing a continuation of his good offices than as expressive of gratitude for past kindnesses. For no man holding official rank in Syria has ever enjoyed more popularity or obtained more general consideration than the Chevalier Guise. Descended from an ancient family of Provence, in which the consular rank may be almost said to have become hereditary, the Levant saw, at the beginning of the present century, the rare occurrence of 3 brothers holding consulships at the same time. After dinner, M. Guy was summoned by Lady Hester Stanhope, and I availed myself of the opportunity it afforded me of remaining at home for the evening. The next morning he departed before I was up, but being anxious to ascertain his opinions of Lady Hester's situation, I mounted my horse, and by taking a short but somewhat dangerous path down the mountains, I overtook him. Nothing particular, however, had transpired in their conversation, which lasted for 4 hours, but he told me that he was shocked to find her so much altered, and that he had never heard such a hollow, sepulchral cough. He added that, frequently during the time he was with her, she fell back on the sofa from exhaustion. She spoke, too, a good deal, and in rather an odd way, of extraordinary sights she had seen, of 2 apparitions that had appeared to her, and of serpents near Tarsus, which go in troops, devouring all before them, and with a tone of conviction as if she believed it all. "What does it mean?" he asked me, "and why do you let her smoke so much?" March 2nd. Lady Hester was now getting better slowly, but, as usual, her strength no sooner began to return than it brought out all the unmanageable points of her character in full relief. Something happened in the house which ruffled her, and produced a discussion between us, I hardly know how. But it ended by her calling me a crabbed old fool, upon which I observed that I never heard such expressions from the lips of ladies before. This set her off upon her inexhaustible theme of fearless speaking. "If you were a duke," said she, "I would use exactly the same expressions." "Your ladyship's talents," I ventured to observe again, "are inexpressibly great. But without questioning that, I only lament the intemperate use of them." Taking up this observation, she dwelt at great length upon the sweetness of her temper, and I made my peace at last by saying that a physician should be the last person to complain of the irritability of his patients. Apophthegms of this submissive character were never lost upon her, provided they were true as well as apologetic. So pipes were ordered, and we entered into an armistice for the rest of the evening. A curious but characteristic incident occurred about this time. In the ravines of the mountains, where the few living creatures that are to be found may be supposed to be drawn into closer communion by a common sense of loneliness, a shepherd named Casem, who was nearly 50 years old, formed a liaison with a village girl, whose occupation consisted in leading a cow about in the solitary green nooks where any scanty herbage was to be secured. The circumstance reached Lady Hester's ears before it was known to anybody else, and she immediately ordered the man to be flogged at break of day, with instructions that nobody should tell him why or wherefore. "He will know what it is for," she exclaimed, when turning reproachfully to Logmoggy, to whom the execution of the order was entrusted. She added, "How is it you leave me to be the first to discover these disgraceful acts, giving the Emir Bashir an excuse to say that I encourage depravity in my servants, when it is your duty to know everything that passes about my premises?" Logmoggy went, gave the shepherd a beating, and sent him about his business. Lady Hester used to justify severities of this description on the ground that it prevented the recurrence of similar licentiousness, and kept the fellows in order. End of Chapter 9, Part 2. Chapter 9, Part 3 of Memoirs of the Lady Hester Stanhope, Volume 2, by Lady Hester Stanhope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, Part 3. March 5th. This being the vigil of the Korban Bairam, or the Mahometan Easter, which is their great holy day, Lady Hester, who had previously given her orders to a person who had some reputation as a pastry cook, dispatched at 12 at night 3 servants, each with a senya, or round tray, on which they were to bring back from Saida by daylight the baklava, mamoul, and karabi, 3 delicious sorts of sweet cakes, which are scarcely exceeded in delicacy by the choicest pastry of Europe. At noon the servants, dressed in all their new finery, sat down to a copious dinner composed of the most luxurious Eastern dishes. But there was no wine, for whatever transgressions these people may commit in that way in private, they never touch wine in public. Logmoggy and some others were known not to be much troubled with such scruples when they could indulge themselves in secret. But Logmoggy always excused himself on the score of being a Freemason, which is held in Turkey to be equivalent to a jovial fellow who does not care much what he does. The women also had their own feast, and a piece of gold the value of 20 piastres was presented to each of the servants. The day was literally abandoned to pleasure. But what a contrast do the sober manners of Mahometans form to those of Europeans! Gambling and noisy revels are out of the question in the tranquil and easy delights in this simple race. Dancing is generally confined to the boys, or to some buffoon who gets up and wriggles about to the music of a small tambourine, beaten with a single stick and producing a dull sound which they consider musical, and which habit renders not disagreeable even to European ears. Every man smokes his pipe, and a good story-teller, for such a one is rarely wanting in a party of a dozen, relates some traditionary tale, which absorbs for the time all the faculties of his hearers. The cook was one of this sort, a Christian of the village of Abra, a shrewd fellow who went by the name of Deek, or the Cock, from his rather strutting air, or from the vigorous exercise of his authority over his wife, whom he beat every now and then to keep her in proper discipline, a redeeming quality in the eyes of Lady Hester, who otherwise would have dismissed him from her service. Lady Hester's astrological powers were put to a practical test today. Fatum, one of her maidservants, whose name has frequently occurred in these pages, required my medical services under the following circumstances. About 6 years before, having, in league with Zeynep, a black girl, and some men of the village, robbed her mistress of several valuable effects, she was turned away. But upon exhibiting great repentance, she was taken back again. Lady Hester found no difficulty, as may be supposed, in extracting from her a confession of the system of plunder that had been carried on, and the names of her accomplices. "I could hang them all," was her constant expression in speaking of them. Fatum had been in her ladyship's service 10 or 11 years, and was not yet 20. And being very pretty, and decked out in the finery to which she was enabled to help herself by her share of the plunder, she had vanity enough, when she was turned away, to hope that she should get at least an aga for a husband. But she was disappointed, and was obliged to put up with a small farmer. She consequently came back a married woman in poor plight as to circumstances, with the prospect of having her difficulties aggravated by a speedy increase to her cares. On this day, 5th of March, Fatum complained of pains. There was not a moment to be lost. The midwife was instantly sent for. Fatum was hurried away to her mother's in the village, and before the expiration of a quarter of an hour she gave birth to a boy. As soon as Lady Hester learned the result, she requested me to go and see her. I found Fatum sitting on a mattress on the floor, for nobody in the East has a bedstead, with from 15 to 20 women squatted around her, the midwife supporting her back, and the child lying by her, covered with a corner of the quilt. Fatum, very yellow, looked as if she had been in a great fright, and was astonished there was so little in it. After feeling her pulse, and delivering to her mother a basket of good things, such as lump sugar, 6 or 8 sorts of spices, etc., with which it is customary to make the caudle upon these occasions, as also a new counterpane, and 2 silk pillows for her lying in present, I took a glance at the village gossips. There they were, holding forth much in the same way as the peasantry in other countries, with this difference, that here my presence was no restraint, and the minutest details of the recent event were discussed with as little reserve as if they had been talking of the ordinary incidents of the day. Having returned to Lady Hester with an account of what I had seen, she immediately set about casting the infant's nativity, first ascertaining accurately the hour at which he was born, a quarter before 2. "He will have," said she, "arched eyebrows, rolling eyes, and a nose so and so. He will be a devil, violent in his passions, but soon pacified. His fingers will be long and taper, without being skinny and bony." And thus she went on, in a manner so impressed with faith and earnestness, that it is not to be wondered at how persons of good judgment have lent their ears to astrologers, where the study has been fortified by a previous knowledge of man, his temperaments, and the innate and external characteristics of passions, of virtue, and of vice. She gave him the name of Salim, and sent word to say his star agreed with hers very well. This was good news for Fatum, as it was equivalent to Lady Hester's taking charge of the infant. The cradle had already been prepared. It was of wood, painted green, something like a trough, and perforated at the bottom as is usual in the East. A tube of wood with a bowl to it, exactly of the form of a tobacco pipe, is tied to the child's waist, a rude but ingenious contrivance to save trouble to the nurse, the bowl serving as the immediate recipient, and the tube passing through the side of the cradle. March 7th. This being Wednesday, Lady Hester, as usual, was invisible. What she did on these mysterious days I never heard, for a person once away from her might as well divine how the man in the moon was employed as guess how she was passing her time. Thursday, March 8th. I saw Lady Hester about 4 o'clock. She was in a very irritable state. She complained bitterly, as usual, of her servants, of their neglect, ignorance, and heartlessness. She said she would rather be surrounded by robbers, for there is some principle amongst thieves. "Oh," she exclaimed, "that I could find one human being who knew his Creator." She went on, "I have had a very bad night, and whether I shall live or die, I don't know. But this I tell you beforehand, that if I do die, I wish to be buried like a dog in a bit of earth just big enough to hold this miserable skin, or else to be burnt or thrown into the sea. And as I am no longer an English subject, no consuls nor any English of any sort shall approach me in my last moments, for if they do, I will have them shot. Therefore, the day before I die, if I know it, I shall order you away, and not only you, but everything English. And if you don't go, I warn you beforehand, you must take the consequences. Let me be scorched by the burning sun, frozen by the cold blast. Let my ashes fly in the air. Let the wolves and jackals devour my carcass. Let—" Here the agitation she was in, and which had kept increasing, brought on a severe fit of coughing, and it was a quarter of an hour before she could recover strength enough to speak again. Her exhaustion reduced her to a little calm. After dinner I saw her again, but now her irritability had passed away. "Take your chair," said she, "here by the bed. Turn your back to the window to save your poor eyes from the light. Never mind me. There, I am afraid I have overworked them by so much writing. But I know if you did not write for me, you would be writing or reading for yourself. You are just like my sister Griselda." She went on, "You are angry with me, I dare say, because I told you I would not have you near me when I am dying. But I suppose I may do as I please. No English consul shall touch me or my effects. No. When I was going, sooner than that, I will call in all the thieves and robbers I can find, and set them to plunder and destroy everything. But I shall not die so. I shall die as St. Elias and Isaac did. And before that I shall have to wade through blood up to here, and she drew her hand across her neck. "Nor will a spark of commiseration move me. The Bab el Tobi, gate of pardon, will then be shut. For neither king, nor priest, nor peasant shall enter when that hour comes. You and others will then repent of not having listened to my words." Saturday, March 10th. Let us take this night as a sample of many others, to show sometimes what was doing in a solitary residence on Mount Lebanon, in which the vivid fancies of European writers had conjured up an imaginary mode of existence wholly different from the sad reality. From 8 o'clock at night until 1 in the morning, Lady Hester Stanhope had kept the house in commotion upon matters which would seem so foreign to her rank, her fortune, and her supposed occupations, that when enumerated they will hardly be believed. First, there was a deliberation of half an hour to decide whether it would be best to send the mules on the next day or the day after for wheat. Then several servants were to be questioned, one after another, in order to compare their conflicting testimony, whether her fields of barley had come up, and how high, and what crops they promised. Next, whether the oranges, now fit to be gathered, should be put under the gardener's care, or into a storeroom in the house. Then ensued a conversation with me whether Fatum was not playing some deep game and pretending to be separated from her husband, and so on, with a score of other topics equally unimportant, but with all of which she worried herself so effectively that it seemed as if she willingly sought refuge in such petty annoyances for the sake of escaping from secret heart-burnings which she did not choose to betray. In this way she had the secretary called up twice from his bed, and the bailiff once, keeping the rest of the servants in continual motion, whilst I was obliged, in civility, to sit and listen to it all. Old Pierre had been sent for from Dair el Kamar. As a person who figures occasionally in these domestic scenes, I must make the reader a little acquainted with his history. In the year 1812, when Lady Hester was travelling from Jerusalem along the coast towards Damascus, we reached Dair el Kamar, where Pierre came and offered himself to me as a servant. I took him, but his various talents as a cook, a guide, and an interpreter, and most of all as an adventurer who had an extraordinary fund of anecdotes to relate, soon brought him into notice with Lady Hester, and she asked him of me for her own service. He accompanied us to Palmyra and through different parts of Syria, resided with her at Latakia and Mar Elias, and remained in her service many years. Having amassed a little money, he obtained permission to retire to Dair el Kamar, where he kept a cook's shop, or, if you will, a tavern. But Lady Hester never lost sight of him. From time to time, when any traveller left her house to traverse Mount Lebanon, or to journey to Damascus and Aleppo, or even to Palmyra, Pierre was recommended as interpreter and guide, and, I understand, always discharged his duties to the satisfaction of his employers. He is known to many Englishmen, among the rest to the Reverend Mr. Way, who seems to have been very good to him, and Pierre, on his side, retains a most grateful remembrance of that gentleman's bounty. Pierre springs from a good family by the name of Marquis or Marquise, originally of Marseilles, and afterwards established as merchants in Syria. When he was a boy, he accompanied an uncle to France, who took him to Paris. The uncle wore the Levantine dress, and having some business to transact connected with government, was on one occasion summoned to Versailles, where the court was. Chance or design threw Pierre in the way of the king, Louis XVI., who talked to him about the Levant, as did also Monsieur, afterwards Louis XVIII. Of this conversation Pierre never failed to make considerable boast. On his return to Syria, Pierre lived with his relations until Bonaparte laid siege to Acre, where his knowledge of the French language recommended him to the notice of that general. He bore a commission in his army, and on the retreat of the French into Egypt accompanied them, and remained there until the final evacuation, when he obtained a pension, but of which he declared he had never touched a sou, in consequence of residing abroad. Monsieur Urbain, a contributor to the Temps, happening to meet with Pierre when he was traveling in Syria, was so highly diverted with his anecdotes that on his return to France he wrote no less than 3 feuilletons, or notices on la vie Pierre. At least, so I was informed by Monsieur Guy. Pierre had been sent for by Lady Hester Stanhope, and she assigned him a room close to the doors of her own quadrangle, that he might be always within call. Pierre was a man exceedingly thin, with an aquiline nose and a steady eye, full of gastonade to be mistaken for courage, wonderfully loquacious, and deeply imbued with all the mystic doctrines that Lady Hester sometimes preached about. But Pierre's chief merit lay in his star, which, she assured me, was so propitious to her that it could calm her convulsions and lay her to sleep when books, narcotics, and everything else failed. Glancing in these desultory memorials from one person to another, I may here mention that one of the maids, named Sadie, incurred the particular aversion of Lady Hester, just as strongly as Pierre was favored with her partiality. Poor Sadie never entered her presence without being saluted by some epithet of disgust or opprobrium. Yet Sadie worked from morning till night, and seldom got to bed until 3, 4, or 5 o'clock in the morning. But Lady Hester insisted on the necessity of treating her servants in this way for the purpose of keeping them on the alert, and she would frequently quote her grandfather's example to prove how powerful particular aversions were in people of exalted minds, such as hers and his. In this way she kept herself in a state of constant irritation, as if she were determined obstinately to oppose the inroads of disease by increased exertion, exactly in proportion as her physical strength had become more and more weakened and reduced. Monday, March 12th. 2 servant boys were flogged by Logmagi for having quitted the courtyard both at the same time, when one at least was wanted to carry messages from the inner to the outer courts. These punishments were inflicted by making the delinquent lie at his full length flat on the ground, his head being held by one servant and his feet by another, while the stripes were administered. My disposition revolted at these whippings, although perhaps they were necessary, as Lady Hester said. The servants would not have borne them, but that they had in fact no choice, knowing well that they must either remain and be flogged, or be sent to the Nizam, where they would be flogged twice as much, with the risk of being killed to boot. Wednesday, March 14th. Lady Hester was in very low spirits this evening, and as night advanced she had a paroxysm of grief which quite terrified me. With a ghastly and frenzied look, she kept crying until my heart was rent with her wretchedness. When I left her for the night, although she was somewhat composed, her image haunted me, even when sleep had closed my eyes. End of Chapter 9, Part 3. Chapter 10, Part 1 of Memoirs of the Lady Hester Stanhope, Volume 2 by Lady Hester Stanhope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, Part 1. Mr. Foster and Mr. Knox, two English gentlemen, came up to June this morning to pay a visit to Lady Hester. To my great surprise, I found them seated at the porter's lodge among the servants who were standing around them, a situation to which they accommodated themselves with the good sense of men of the world. They had sent in a message that 2 Franks were at the gate, having a letter for the seat milady, and were patiently awaiting the result. I took the liberty of inquiring their names and hastened to her ladyship, whilst orders were given to conduct them immediately to the stranger's room. Lady Hester, who had got their letter in her hand, told me one was a relation of Sir Augustus Forster, our ambassador at Turin. "Go instantly to them," said she, "for Sir Augustus is an old friend of mine, and be particularly attentive to Mr. Forster, indeed to both of them. Tell them I'm very sorry I can't see them, for when I get into conversation I become animated, and then I feel the effects of it afterwards. But assure them that they are welcome to make their home of their present lodging for a couple of days or a couple of hours, or as long as they like. Do they look like gentlemen?" she asked. "Ah," continued she, "what a charm good breeding gives to mankind, and how odious vulgarity is after it! Only reflect, I, who have been all my life accustomed to the most refined society, what I must feel sometimes to have nothing to do but with beasts. But go, and make them as comfortable as you can." They were in the stranger's room, which stood in a small garden, ornamented with a few rose bushes, pomegranate and olive trees, and some flowering plants. It was a little enclosure, which had by no means a disagreeable aspect, surrounded by a wall topped with prickly thorn bushes. Once inside this place, the newcomer could know nothing of what was passing without. Such were Lady Hester's contrivances. Everything about her must wear an air of mystery. I lost no time in conveying Lady Hester's message to them, and for the short hour I enjoyed the pleasure of their conversation, had every reason to rejoice in the opportunity of making their acquaintance. As this visit of 2 travelers may serve as a specimen of what occurred, with slight variations, on every similar occasion when Englishmen came to her house, who were little aware how much trouble their unexpected arrival sometimes caused her, I shall detail what passed as minutely as I can. I had hardly paid my compliments to them, and inquired whether they would take an English breakfast or something more solid, when a message came from Lady Hester to say she wanted to see me for a moment. This was always her way. The ruling passion of ordering what was to be done and what was to be said on all occasions made her impatient about things passing out of her sight. "Well, doctor," cried Lady Hester, "what age do they appear to be, and where do they come from?" Having satisfied her on the first head, I told her they were last from the Emir's palace at Batedin. Then, after some trifling observation, I added the Emir complained to them that M. Lamartine, in his recent work on Syria, had greatly compromised him with Ibrahim Pasha, and having said that he, the Emir, had entertained the most friendly dispositions towards Bonaparte and the French during the siege of Acre. This the Emir denied, and averred that his great friend was Sir Sidney Smith, meaning probably, as I observed from myself, to compliment his present guests at the expense of the absent French. He was very civil to the two travellers, I added, and understanding they were going to see your ladyship, he sent his compliments to you. "Ah," replied she, "that looks as if he were fishing for friends, in case he should shortly have to fly. For they say that Sharif Pasha has been defeated in the Haran, and the Emir begins to tremble, for the Druses will not spare him." I then told Lady Hester they had refused tea or coffee, but as they were come from a distance, would probably like something more substantial. They had expressed, too, a wish for a glass of lemonade. Here Lady Hester, suddenly raising herself in her bed, interrupted me with, "Good God, lemonade! Why, the maid said that the secretary had been to ask for some violet syrup for them. Now, which is it that they want? Can nobody ever take upon them to direct the simplest thing, but they must blunder? Must everything fall upon me?" "Well, but," observed I, "lemonade or violet syrup, it does not matter which." "Not matter? There it is again. And then who is there can make lemonade? Not a soul but myself in the whole house. And poor am I obliged to wear my little strength out in doing the most trivial offices. Here I am. I wanted to write another letter to go by the steamboat, and now all my thoughts are driven out of my head. Zezaphoon!" Ding, ding, ding went the bell. "Zezaphoon, order the gardener to bring me 4 or 5 of the finest lemons on the tree next the alley of roses, you know where I mean, and prepare a tray with glasses." This was accordingly done, and Lady Hester, sitting up in bed, went to work squeezing lemons and making lemonade. In my way to her ladyship's room from the strangers, I had called the cook and directed him to dress a mutton chop, to make a vermicelli soup, a dish of spinach and eggs, a little tunny fish salad, and with a cold rice pudding, which I recollected and sent for from my house, and some Parmesan cheese. I trusted there would be enough for a hasty meal. Whilst making the lemonade, the following conversation went on. "Now, doctor, what can be got for their déjeuner à la fourchette? For there is nothing whatever in the house." I mentioned what I had ordered. "Ah, yes," resumed Lady Hester. "Let me see. There is a stew of yesterday's that I did not touch, that may be warmed up again, and some potatoes may be added. And then you must taste that wine that came yesterday from Biography, to see if you think they will like it. The spinach my maid must do. Deek," the cook, does not know how to dress spinach, but I have taught Zezaphoon to do it very well. Ding, ding, ding. Zezaphoon, you know how to boil spinach in milk, and you must garnish it with 5 eggs, 1 in each corner and 1 in the center. Yes, C.T. And Zezaphoon, send the yakni stew to Deke, and let it be warmed up for the strangers. They must have some of my butter and some of my bread. Likewise, give out the silver spoons and knives and forks. They are under that cushion on the ottoman there. And mind you, count them when you give them to Mohammed, or they will steal one and dispute with you afterwards about the number, a pack of thieves. And let the cook send in the dishes necessary, for I will not have any of mine go out. You must tell the travellers, doctor, and especially Mr. Forster, for he is an Irishman, that I have a great deal of Irish and Scotch blood in me, and no English. Tell him I have made great investigations on the subject of the origin of the Scotch, and could prove to him that they came originally from this country. Tell him how beautiful the Irish women are, and that I, having had opportunities of seeing some of the finest Circassians and Georgians of the harems of great Turks here and at Constantinople, think there are none like Irish women. If Mr. Forster asks you anything about the Druses, as he seems to interest himself concerning the religion of that people, say to him that the Druses, the Ansaris, the Ishmaelites, all these sects must and will remain a mystery to strangers. There was Monsieur Reynaud, one of the 40 savants who wrote the great book on Egypt, and was afterwards consul at Sidon. If anybody could comprehend the secret, he could. Yet, although he had 4 of the Druze books in his possession, and 5 learned persons of this country to assist him in translating and explaining them through a whole winter, he could make out nothing. Because even if you understand the text, you are still not a bit the wiser. Suppose, for example, you open a page, and you find these words: "Do you use senna leaves?" which is one of their questions of recognition, like similar apparently vague questions in Freemasonry. What do you know about that? You may understand the answer clearly enough, so far as mere words go, but it is useless unless you understand the thing of which the words are a symbol, for they are all symbolical. You must know that it refers to an insurgent, who in the cause of their faith raised the standard of revolt centuries ago in the land where senna grows, and that it implies, do you adopt his tenets? And so of other passages. The chiefs of their religion cannot make any disclosures, for if they did, their lives would be the forfeit. Tell them they are a bold, sanguinary race, who will cut a man in pieces themselves, or see it done by others, and never change color. Why, one of them, not long since, killed or wounded with his own hands 5 of Ibrahim Pasha's soldiers, who were sent to seize him as a refractory recruit. Here Lady Hester, having finished making the lemonade, stopped for a moment to desire Zezaphoon to take it out and send it to the stranger's room. She then resumed. "Tell them, doctor, that no people will bear a flogging like the Druses. The Spartans were nothing to them. Isn't it the Spartans that were such floggers? For I am such a dunce that I can never recollect some things which every schoolboy knows. And I always said I was a dunce in some things, although Mr. Pitt used to say, 'Hester, If you would but keep your own counsel, nobody could detect it. But it is the truth. And when you talk to me of paper money and the funds, although I may understand for the moment what you try to explain to me, I forget it all the next morning. Yet on subjects which my inclination leads me to investigate, nobody has a better judgment. My father, with all his mathematical knowledge, used to say I could split a hair. Talk to the point, was his cry, and I could bring truth to a point as sharp as a needle. I divested a subject of all extraneous matter, and there it was. You might turn and twist it as you would, but you must always come back to that. The Druses like me, and all the Emir Bashir's hatred of me arose from my friendship for the Sheikh Bashir. After you left me, I went to stay with him at Makhtara, where he assigned me a wing of the palace to live in. He was a clever man, and afterwards, in his troubles, came to me for advice and succor. He offered me a third of his treasures, but I refused them. When he fled, the Emir Bashir got about a third of them. An equal portion, they say, is buried, and the remainder was carried off by his wife, but afterwards lost. Poor woman, she is dead now. It was the attempt to relieve her, amongst other causes, that drew me into embarrassments. She had fled, her husband was a captive at Acre, and the Emir was pursuing her in every direction to take her life. The snow was thick on the ground. She had with her a child at the breast, one 2 years old, and another. 2 were with the father in prison. I dispatched people with clothes and money to relieve her immediate wants. They found her in the Haran, where she had taken refuge with an old servant. Her daughter also applied to me for assistance, but I was penniless and could do nothing for her. Poor girl! She was afterwards married, but Ibrahim Pasha cut off her husband's head, and she went raving mad. To complete the tragedy, Hannah Aboud, one of those I sent to look after her, fell asleep out of weariness, after having returned home on foot through the snow, and got an inflammation in his eyes which ended in total blindness. The journey back occupied, I think, 40 hours. I have been obliged partially to maintain the poor fellow and Verdi, his wife, ever since. Perhaps, Doctor, Mr. Forster and Mr. Knox may have heard of the extraordinary conduct of the English government towards me. So let them know that I am not low-spirited about it, and although the Queen may think herself justified in taking away my pension, I would not, even if I were a beggar, change places with her. As for the Queen's interfering in my affairs, she might just as well go and stop Sir Augustus Forster's salary on the plea that he had left his tailor's bill unpaid. My debts were incurred very often for things I did not care about for myself. For example, what are books to me, who never look into them? If I had been like you doctors, who tell your patients to take turtle soup and then contrive to be asked to dinner, it were another thing. But my researches were for the good of others, and for no advantage of my own. When I think what I have done, and what I could have done if I had had more money. There was a book came into my hands, which the owner, not knowing its value, offered for my acceptance, as you would offer an old brass candlestick. I consulted several persons about it, and when all assured me it was a valuable manuscript, I scorned to take advantage of the man's ignorance, and returned it to him, telling him when I was rich enough I would buy it of him. Ought not a person to act so? Undoubtedly, I replied. A person of principle would not act otherwise. Principle? She exclaimed. What do you mean by principle? I am a Pitt. As I did not understand precisely why a Pitt should be above principle, although it would seem there is a species of integrity higher than principle itself, I held my tongue, and Lady Hester went on. I know where to find a book that contains the language spoken by Adam and Eve. The letters are a span high. Such things have fallen into my hands as have fallen into nobody else's. I know where the serpent is that has the head of a man, like the one that tempted Eve. The cave still exists, not far from Tarsus, and the villages all about are exempted from the Miri in consideration of feeding the serpents. Everybody in that neighborhood knows it. Isn't it extraordinary? Why don't you answer? Is it or is it not? Good God! I should go mad if I were obliged to remain 3 whole days together in your society. I'm sure I should. Such a cold man I never saw. There is no getting an answer from you. However, think as you like. These serpents will march through the country to fight for the Messiah, and will devour everything before them. Here she paused for about a minute, and then added, I think you had better not tell them anything about the serpents. Perhaps their minds are not prepared for matters of this sort. I have already observed that Monsieur Guy had mentioned, with some surprise, the serious manner in which Lady Hester spoke of these serpents, and although he did not express it, yet he half intimated that he thought her intellects a little disordered. We shall see hereafter if they were so. Lady Hester resumed. But now, doctor, if you can spare a minute, you must write a line by the messenger to Monsieur Guy, and tell him I had begun a letter to him, but that the arrival of 2 English travellers, one of whom revived a number of recollections, had obliged me to stop short, and I could write no more. Doctor, this Mr. Forster must be one of the children of the Irish speaker. He was left with 10, and I remember very well one day that H. was standing before me at a party, making a number of bows and scrapes, turning up his eyes and cringing before me so, that when we got home Mr. Pitt said to me, Hester, if I am not too curious, what could H. have to say that animated him so much? What could he be making such fine speeches about? What could call forth such an exuberance of eloquence in him? Oh, it was nothing, answered I. He was telling me that all the power of the Treasury was at my service, that he would take care that Lady S.N.'s pension should be got through the different offices immediately, that he had nothing so much at heart as to execute my orders, that he would see all that was necessary should be done according to my wishes, and so on. But as I despised the man, I only laughed at him and turned my back on him, for I drink at the fountainhead. Now, this is really too good a thing, interrupted Mr. Pitt, lifting up his eyes in astonishment. It was but this very day, at 3 o'clock, that he was urging me not to let this very pension be given, or at least to prolong the business for a year, if it were possible, till, by tiring her patience, the thing might be dropped, or something turn up to set it aside, adding that it would be opening the door to abuses, and if I granted this too readily, I should have Forster's 10 children to provide for. Lady Hester went on. From that day I knew my man. I then said to Mr. Pitt, "Let me show him who he has to deal with. Do give your orders that the thing may be done immediately." "Oh, but it is too late to-night," said Mr. Pitt. "No, it is not," I cried, "for I see a light in the Treasury." So I rang and sent for— Here her ladyship mentioned a name which I could not catch, but I think it was Mr. Chinnery. When he came, I said to him, "Will you be so good, sir, the first thing in the morning, to see that all the signatures are put to Lady S.N.'s paper? There is Mr. Pitt. Ask him if it is so or not." Mr. Pitt of course assented, and there the matter ended. Doctor, I had a great deal of trouble with those sorts of people, like H. Now, if Mr. Forster is about 35 years old, he must be one of that family. Do tell Mr. Forster what a pack of beasts those servants are. Ask him if he ever heard of women throwing themselves down to sleep in the middle of a courtyard, or on the floor of a kitchen, dragging their quilt after them from place to place. Tell them that is what mine do, and that I am obliged to wait a quarter of an hour for a glass of water. You may talk to them a little about stars, but I dare say you will commit some horrible blunder, as you always do, and that is what makes me so afraid of your having to say anything that concerns me. Tell Mr. Forster that in people's stars lie their abilities, and that you may bring up 100 men to be generals and another 100 to be lawyers, but out of these perhaps 4 or 5 only will turn out good for anything. When a Grand Lama is to be chosen, why do they go about until they have found a particular boy with certain marks, known to the learned of that country, a child born under a certain star? It is because, when they have found such a one, he has no occasion for instruction. He is born the man for their purpose. Thus, the Duke of Wellington is not a general by trade. I mean by instruction. For if examined before a court-martial on all the branches of military tactics, perhaps he would be found deficient. Hundreds may know more of them than he does, but he is a general by his star. He acts under a certain impulse which makes him hit on the stratagem he ought to practice, and without the help of previous study, or even the suggestions of experience, he knows that his maneuver is right. It was thus with me when I was young. People might preach and talk, but when I saw them doing things or reasoning about them, I could at once distinguish the things that were right from the things that were wrong. But I could not say why or wherefore. My father said I was the best logician he ever saw. I could split a hair. The last time he saw me, he repeated the same words, and said I had but one fault, which was being too fond of royalty. End of Chapter 10, Part 1. Chapter 10, Part 2 of Memoirs of the Lady Hester Stanhope, Volume 2, by Lady Hester Stanhope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, Part 2. I observed here to Lady Hester that in many things she reminded me of the ancient philosophers, to whom she bore a strong resemblance on most points, but that in this one particular she differed from them widely. as most of them were strenuously opposed to royalty and monarchical power. "My liking for royalty," she answered, "is not indiscriminate, but I believe in the divine right of kings, for I have found it out. And you may ask Mr. Forster also why the bottle of oil came from India to anoint the kings of France. I dare say they never heard of Malek es-Saif, a hero whose exploits and names are hardly inferior in the East to those of Solomon. Is it not extraordinary that in Europe they know nothing of those people, of him and his 40 sons, all of whom were men of note in their time? This must be so, for some of the gates of Cairo are named after them. If you happen to speak about the Albanians and the other soldiers that I had here, tell them I did not see them all. I only saw the most desperate, and those whose violence was to be kept under. When I admitted them to my presence, I was always alone, and they always wore their arms, but I never feared them." Thus Lady Hester went on talking. The dish of potatoes, the dessert, and several other things were forgotten. So reminding her that Mr. Forster and Mr. Knox must be all this time marveling what could have detained me, I at last made my escape. In the meanwhile the breakfast had been served up, as well as the resources of the place would admit. The scene must have been highly curious to her ladyship's guests, who could not fail to be amused as well as surprised at the sight of a deal table, rush-bottomed chairs, cheese put on first, and a pudding in a copper dish after it, with other anomalies that would have made even a third-rate Brummel shudder. But the occasions for eating in the European way in Lady Hester's house occurred very rarely, and the servants, who were habituated to Turkish usages or to the mongrel service of some Levantine dragoman, had no notions of the regulations of an English table. In my own house I had 2 tolerably well-trained boys, but there was an interdict against their ever crossing the threshold of Lady Hester's gate, in order that no information of what was going on within her walls should be carried out to the female part of my family. In the most common concerns, Lady Hester's servants made much bustle and did little. They ran in different directions, jostled and crossed each other 6 at a time for the same thing, entirely reversing one of her favorite maxims, that everything in a great person's house should be done as if by magic, and nobody should know who it was set it a-going. These servants had but one spring of action, and that was the bakshish, or present, which they all looked for on the departure of a stranger. It was a painful thought to me, as these gentlemen left the gate, that when they were about to mount their horses, the mercenary spirit of such a set of varlets might be charged to the connivance of the mistress. The 2 travelers made a miserable repast, and when it was over, signified their desire to take leave. It seems they had taken Lady Hester's invitation to make the place their home for 2 hours or 2 days in its literal acceptation. And it is scarcely necessary to say that there was no time for me to enter into an explanation on the subject, nor indeed to deliver a 10th part of the discursive matter with which Lady Hester had charged me. It was from these gentlemen I learned, for the first time, that a committee had been appointed on the motion of Mr. D. W. Harvey for inquiring into the pensions on the civil list. It had so happened that no newspapers had reached us for a long time, and consequently this was the first intimation her ladyship had received of a measure in which it might be supposed she felt no inconsiderable interest, although in reality she did not. As Mr. Forster and his friend had to cross a deep valley and mount a steep ascent before they could take the road to Beirut, to which town they were now going, I sent Ali Haisham, the messenger, to put them on their way. He returned in the course of an hour or two, and was dispatched the same evening on foot, with letters to Beirut, where he arrived next day before Messrs. Knox and Forster. He told me on his return that their surprise was very great on finding him at the inn, knowing that they had left him behind them the morning before up the mountain. Ali's account of Mr. Forster's regimentals, in which he saw him dressed at Beirut, was very flaming, and from that day, in speaking of the two, he always distinguished him from Mr. Knox by the title of the General. Lady Hester deeply regretted that she was not able to see these gentlemen. "Ah," said she, "how many times have I been abused by the English when I did not deserve it, and for nothing so much as for not seeing people when perhaps it was quite out of my power. There was Mr. Anson and Mr. Strangeways, who, because I refused to see them, sat down under a tree and wrote me such a note. Little did they know that I had not a bit of barley in the house for their horses, and nothing for their dinner. I could not tell them so, but they might have had feeling enough to suppose it was not without some good reason that I declined their visit. Many a pang has their ill nature given me, as well as that of others. I have got the note still somewhere. Among the visitors I have had was the Duchess of Gontat's brother, she that brought up the Duke of Bordeaux. I suppose she must have talked of me to her brother, whom I never recollect. However, he came with his 2 sons, but I would not see him. It was that time when Monsieur Guy, after sitting and staring at me some minutes, exclaimed, "Madame, when I see you dressed in that abba, the Bedouin cloak, in that keffiyeh, the Bedouin visor, and when I think you are that Lady Hester Stanhope, qui fait sous la pluie et le beau temps à Londres, I am lost in wonder how you could have come and fixed yourself in these desolate mountains." Another of Charles X's courtiers came here, but a higher personage, whom I also refused to see. He was dreadfully savage about it, too. I fancy Charles X had a secret intention of resigning the crown, and of coming to this country to finish his days in the Holy Land like another St. Louis, and I think this man had something to ask me about it. However, I refused to see him. But it was not caprice, nor, as this proves, was it Englishmen alone I denied myself to. Sometimes I was not well enough to sustain a conversation. Sometimes I had no provisions in the house, perhaps no servant who knew how to set a table. But travellers never fancied that there could be any other reason for my refusal but the determination to affront them. God knows, when I could, I was willing to receive anybody. Once I had a visit from 2 persons, whom we will call Mr. A and Mr. B, or Mr. B and Mr. C, what letter you like. I thought Mr. B very stupid, but good God, doctor, there was never anything so vulgar as Mr. C. When I got his note to ask leave to come, the name deceived me. I thought he might be a son of Admiral C. But when he came into the room, with his great thighs and pantaloons so tight that he could hardly sit down, I thought he was more like a butcher than anything else. He was a man entirely without breeding, with his ma'ams and ladyships. I asked him a few questions, as, "Pray, sir, will you allow me to ask you if you are a relation of Admiral C's?" "No, ma'am, I am no relation at all." "Will you permit me to inquire what is the motive of your visit to me?" "Only to see your ladyship, ma'am." "Do you come to this country with any particular object?" "To be a merchant." "You are probably conversant in mercantile affairs?" "No, ma'am, I am come to learn," and so on. After some time I told them that I never saw people in the morning, and would take my leave of them, as they probably would wish to set off early, and I desired them to order what they liked for their breakfast. Next morning, when I thought, as a matter of course, they were gone, in came a note from them to say they were not going till next day, and then another to say they did not know, and then a third to say that as they expected ships, and God knows what, they must go. Good God, they might go to the devil for me. I had taken my leave of them, and there was an end of it. Mr. C. was a downright vulgar merchant's clerk, come to Syria, I suppose, to set up for himself. Lord St. Asaph said to me, "Lady Hester, you really should consider who you are, and not allow people of that description to pay visits to you." There was a man who bore a great resemblance to the Duke of Cambridge and the Duke of Clarence, but something between both, who passed 2 or 3 years in this neighbourhood, and sometimes came to see me. He was good-natured, and I liked him. He went about with a sort of pedlar's box, full of trinkets and gewgaws to show to the peasant woman, thus bringing the whole population of the village out of their houses, and then giving away beads and earrings to get the young girls around him. Of the English who have visited me here, I liked Captain Patchell and Captain York very much, and thought them both clever men. Colonel Howard Vyse one day came up to the village and wrote me a note, and did everything he could to see me. He was an old Coldstream. It broke my heart not to see him, but it would have revived too many melancholy reflections. Poor man, I believe he was very much hurt, but I could not help it. A man came here, I believe the only one who was saved out of a party that was killed going across the desert, and asked me for a letter to the Arabs. I sent him away, telling him that he might just as well come and ask me for a pot of beer. What had I to do with their schemes and their navigation of the Euphrates? Yet for this the officer wrote verses upon the wall of the room against me. Then Mr. Croix de la Barre came, but I could not see him. He said he wanted to talk politics with me and learn the customs and manners of the natives. I should tire you, doctor, if I were to tell you how many have come. I saw Lord B. when he was travelling at the baths of Tiberias, where Abdallah Pasha happened to be. Lord B. proposed calling on the Pasha, and equipped himself for that purpose with a pair of pistols and a yataghan in his girdle, after the fashion of a Turkish subaltern. For the Franks, who surrounded him as dragomans and menials, had taught him to adopt what accorded with their ideas of finery, and not what was suitable to his rank. Luckily he mentioned his intention the day before to me, and I told him that there was a full dress of ceremony in Turkey as well as in Europe, and I lent him the most essential part of it, a beniche, with which he presented himself. At first there was some hesitation, on his entering the room with his people, as to which was the great my lord. For his lordship's doctor, who sat down close by him, and poked his head forward with an air of great attention to what the Pasha said, made him doubt whether the doctor was not the chief personage, it being a part of Oriental etiquette that no dependent should obtrude himself into the least notice in his superior's presence. Nay, generally speaking, it is required that doctors, secretaries, dragomans, and the like should remain standing during such interviews. This difficulty being got over, the Pasha, after some questions about Lord B.'s health, asked him what brought him to Tiberias, a part of his province the least beautiful and most barren. The question would have led most persons to say that, knowing the Pasha was there, he seized the opportunity of paying his respects to him, or some such complimentary speech. But Lord B., with a naivete somewhat plebeian, replied that he came to see the baths. The Pasha coldly desired that proper persons should show them to him, and soon after broke up the interview. The very attendants of his Highness were struck with the incivility and want of tact which Lord B. showed, and it was one of them who told me the story. But this was not all. The Pasha, who was fond of consulting European doctors, requested Lord B., who was to depart next day, to leave his doctor behind for 24 hours, which request Lord B. refused. After he was gone, the Pasha sent me a pelisse of considerable value, with a request that I should present it in his name to Lord B., but I returned it, saying Lord B. was gone, for I did not think his incivility deserved it. So much for English breeding. And then let them go and call the Turks barbarians. Mr. Elliot came to see me from Constantinople, in order to make the pashas and governors of the neighboring provinces treat me well. He fell ill, and I sent for the doctor of a frigate that was on the coast for him, a man who could kick his forehead with his toe. I quizzed Mr. Elliot a great deal. But now, doctor, what did Mr. Forster say about the Scotch? If he agrees with me that they sprang from hereabouts, I might have given him some useful hints on that subject, but we will write him a letter about it. When I told her that Mr. Forster had spoken of a work of Sir Jonah Barrington's on Ireland, in which it was said that Mr. Pitt got up the Irish rebellion in order to make the necessity of the Union more palatable to Parliament, she observed that if she met him she would settle his business for him. Mr. Pitt liked the Irish, said she. There were some fools who thought to pay their court by abusing them, and would talk of men's legs like Irish porters, or some such stuff. But I always answered that they would be very much pleased to have their own so, which was much better than having them like a pair of tongs. And I was certain to observe a little smile of approbation in Mr. Pitt's eyes at what I had said. In this way her ladyship would run on from topic to topic, with a rapidity and fluency which frequently rendered it difficult to preserve notes of even the heads of her discourse. Her health was slightly improved. She attended a little more closely to my advice, but still would never allow me to see her until her coughing fit was over, which usually lasted for about a couple of hours. Notwithstanding this, her pulse maintained a degree of vigor which was very extraordinary, considering the state of attenuation to which she was reduced. She had a great reluctance in touching on her bad symptoms, but dwelt readily on such as were favourable. "I certainly have got small abscesses," she answered to me, "but it is not consumption, because there are hours in the day when my lungs are perfectly free, as there are others when I can hardly breathe. Sometimes, doctor, my pulse is entirely gone, or so thin as to be but just perceptible and no more. You pretend to find it very readily and tell me it is not bad. But Zézaphoun can't feel it, and Saida can't feel it, and old Pierre has tried and says the same. I think, too," continued she, "I was a little delirious this morning, for when I awoke I asked where Zézaphoun had gone, although there she was, sitting up on her mattress by my bedside before my eyes." End of Chapter 10, Part 2. End of Memoirs of the Lady Hester Stanhope, Volume 2, edited by Charles Louis Meryon by Lady Hester Stanhope. Read by PhyllisV.